A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I've had this kink for as long as I can remember, but I didn't understand it until I was deep into adulthood, living in a cramped studio apartment in a city that never sleeps, where every night seemed to echo the whispers of 1,000 secrets. I found myself enthralled by the fantasy of becoming tiny, not just in stature but in existence, shrunk down to the size of a doll, helpless under the looming shadows of towering furniture and the vastness of the human world. It started as harmless roleplay, discovering the most absurdly designed dollhouse online and crafting it into a vivid landscape of my own imagination. As I nested inside this miniature universe, I felt a rush of liberation intermingled with terror, envisioning myself running from the dangers that were always there but scarcely recognized. I would spend hours lost in the reverie of those fantasies, where I was fragile enough to slip between the cracks of reality, sneaking around the edges of the life that hovered above me like a giant, blissfully unaware of my existence. I decorated my dollhouse, filling it with tiny furniture, assembling entire board games with pieces that resembled a grain of rice, and my world transformed. Everything glittered and shimmered with the promise of adventure, but the darker side of my yearning loomed over me like a heavy cloud. One night, after too many drinks with my roommate, I confessed my fascination, expecting laughter or ridicule, but to my surprise, she seemed intrigued. Amanda, always the bold one, suggested we take it further. What if, she said, we transformed the apartment so it felt more like my fantasy? With her help, we spent weeks rearranging furniture and filling the space with makeshift craft items tailored to my wild imagination. Together, we rigged up a tiny swing made from an old shoelace and a paperclip, and every inch of our studio became a mixed brooding and whimsical den of escape. But as the real blurred into the surreal, a feeling of dread crept in, wrapped tightly around my heart like a vice grip. It became a ritual. We'd spend dark hours in the living room, shrouded in batteries of fairy lights, constantly enhancing my escapes until they morphed into something darker, twisting once innocent games into eerie rituals that snaked their way into the fabric of our everyday life. Late one night, seeking to push boundaries, I constructed a series of mazes out of boxes and plastic wrap, fully embracing my fantasy of being pursued by ominous monsters lurking in towering shadows. It was exhilarating until something snapped inside me. The lines between fantasy and reality began to bleed. Each time I retreated into my realm, I felt a pull away from Amanda, love turning into a fraying thread beneath the immense weight of my obsession. The dollhouse kept demanding more, the stories started to overlap. I would find myself in dark corners, whispering instructions to a fading world, every object threatening me with its size and presence. Then came the night when I lost myself entirely, a blurring of self that felt like a descent into madness. Only then did I truly comprehend the fear behind the pleasure. Amanda hadn't come home for hours, and I crawled into my dollhouse, haunted by thoughts of being left completely alone. I closed my eyes in the make-believe world, wishing I could dissolve away, just evaporate. But instead, I heard something I had never anticipated, her voice, echoing from somewhere else in the apartment, an unsettling sound within the walls, heavier than all my wispy dreams. Panic gripped me as I thrust my head through the opening of the dollhouse and found her staring. I could see her lips moving, but I couldn't grasp what she said, for her gaze was locked on me, eyes wide, filled with something darker than I had ever seen. "You shouldn't have played," she murmured, and as if the air thickened with dread, I felt my world fracture. I stumbled out, everything around me warped, my heart pounding with the realization that my games had consequences I couldn't have fathomed. My apartment felt alien, shadows danced more ominously, and I swore I could almost feel the walls throb as though they were alive. Was this real? Or just the high of the fantasies I had brought to life? Amanda wasn't the same, her eyes flashed with suspicion, and every smile was laced with a worry I wasn't prepared to confront. I felt smaller with every passing day, shrinking into a frantic anticipation of the night my world would collapse under its own tomfoolery. My fantasies had spiraled into a dark hole, and I couldn't find a way out until, one harrowing evening, I returned to the dollhouse, determined to reclaim my fantasies from whatever torment they had morphed into. But when I leaned in, the world felt off. I couldn't move right, the edges of the dollhouse were jagged, sharp enough to tear the skin, and as my hands shook, I could only hear Amanda's voice echoing in the distance, a long, drawn-out whisper that began absorbing my sanity. "You should have never played." My heart raced, sensing darkness shift within the confines, an encroaching terror, and in that suffocating moment of realization, I understood that some kinks were never meant to be explored. I backed out as the shadows bloomed larger around me, swallowed by the surreal coliseum of imagination morphing into hell, and just like that, All-encompassing fear gripped me as I recognized my world was no longer a playful fantasy, but a reality where I was trapped, because, in this game, I suddenly wasn't playing anymore. I was merely prey, and out there, beyond the walls of my once beloved escape, my fate awaited.
I never considered myself a selfish person, but that all changed the night I found myself face to face with the thing I had cooked, something so ordinary yet so deeply unsettling, and how it pushed me to the brink of sanity. My parents worked long hours, leaving my younger siblings, Ryan, who was 9, and Lily, just 7, under my care, and on that fateful evening, I had taken a rare opportunity to experiment in the kitchen, something they usually encouraged but rarely had time for. I decided to whip up a batch of spaghetti and meatballs, a family classic that I thought they'd devour. The aroma wafted through the house, curling along the walls and wrapping around the corners, promising warmth and satisfaction. But the moment I called them to the table, their faces shifted from curiosity to disgust faster than I could blink. Ryan wrinkled his nose, pushing the plate away, while Lily, in her innocent defiance, declared she'd rather starve. I felt a wave of embarrassment flood my cheeks. After all the effort, after all the chopping and stirring, all I received were pouts and tantrums from 2 kids who would have preferred a cold slice of pizza or, even worse, the remnants of the last week's takeout. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how cooking was hard work, that I put my heart into this dish, but they seemed impervious to my pleas, their whining crescendoing until I felt as if my skin was crawling with irritation. Finally, I snapped, "Fine, if you don't want to eat it, don't. I won't cook you a second meal." The silence that followed was suffocating, but their half-hearted whimpers melted into fake sobs as they pushed their chairs back and skulked away, leaving me to simmer in my frustration alone. I thought they'd go to bed hungry, perhaps even learn a lesson about appreciation. Instead, it seemed I was the one cast as the villain in a twisted fairy tale. After an hour of silence thick enough to cut through, filled with the dread of impending accusations from my parents, I heard a series of soft, rhythmic thuds outside the kitchen window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkening yard, feeling an unsettling chill envelop me. To my disbelief, I noticed 2 distinct shapes just beyond the glow of the streetlight, Ryan and Lily, not playing but standing still, their backs towards me. They wore their usual pajamas, but something was off, their postures rigid like puppets with tangled strings. "What are you 2 doing out there?" I called, but they didn't respond, they just stood there, unmoving. A cold fear crept into my stomach. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, the sudden loss of battery rendering me helpless. I decided I'd had enough of this strange tableau and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached, calling their names again. As I got closer, the silhouette of my siblings twisted into something grotesque, their limbs began to twitch unnaturally, and before I could process it, they turned their heads in unison, their faces contorted into wide, eerie grins that seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't completely lost in madness. "We're not hungry anymore," they screeched in a voice that was neither of them, a chorus of distorted laughter exploding into the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat, a primal urge to run surged through me, but I was rooted in place, entranced by this horror unfolding before me. I backed away, but as I turned, I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You said we should learn a lesson." I shot back to my feet and sprinted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just a fever dream, that my imagination was running wild due to their refusal to eat, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow glide past the window, pacing back and forth as I huddled in a corner like a child afraid of the dark. The incessant tapping began again, this time accompanied by urgent whispers that clawed at my consciousness, a language I couldn't decipher but felt deeply lodged in my psyche. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, adrenaline coursing as I envisioned defending myself against whatever malevolence had taken hold of my siblings. I screamed their names, but all I got in response was a cacophony that churned in my gut, mocking my distress. As the night dragged on, their laughter echoed in the surrounding darkness, a nightmarish lullaby I couldn't escape. I dared to peek outside, and my heart shattered at the fantasy. They were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to yawn before me. Hours passed in a daze, and when dawn finally broke, I curled into a ball on the couch, racked with guilt and dread, unsure if I would face a paranormal nightmare or the wrath of my parents. The light spilled through the window, illuminating the room in a ghostly orange hue. When I summoned the courage to look outside, the yard was empty, devoid of my siblings, free of the twisted realities that had grappled me in the night. They appeared eventually, nonchalant as ever, the peculiar grins faded like the terrors of a waking dream. I didn't mention last night's episode, after all, who would believe me? My parents returned, and everything settled back into the repetitive rhythm of the household, yet a cold thread of tension weaved itself through our lives, quiet moments punctuated by lingering glances and echoes of that laughter, my siblings seemingly unaware of the change in their demeanor, but I recognized the flicker of something darker beneath their innocent facade. Days turned into weeks, and the dread only thickened. I started finding leftovers of food I hadn't made, twisted shapes of Play-Doh like meat, unrecognizable but oddly reminiscent of what I had cooked, lurking in dark corners. I attempted to make my case known, but it sounded ludicrous, and so I buried the fear beneath daily routines, buried it until it became a constant presence, a reminder of one fateful night when I had refused to nurture. I shivered, often dreaming of the dark laughter that would not let me sleep, forever chained to the guilt that grew like a weed. And one night, when the winds whispered through the cracks of our home, I dared to lay my head in resigned silence, but was pulled back into that heavy absence, my siblings out once more, standing like specters beneath the streetlights, faces illuminated in a sickly hue, as if a portal had cracked open between realms, and I was forced to face a harbinger of dread, knowing that somewhere inside I had sealed our fates the day I decided to abandon the very essence of what it meant to share a meal. As I gazed upon their twisted forms, I desperately wished to retract my words, to cook them anything they wanted, though I feared the cost would be far more than a second dinner, and the shadows hinted that the lesson had only just begun to unravel.
I'm tired. Today is probably going to be the day it ends. I've been saying that for weeks now, and each night I crawl into bed with a mind buzzing with despair and an unsettling sense of impending doom. But somehow, I wake up the next morning, and the clouds of exhaustion settle back in. It all started when my father disappeared nearly a month ago, vanishing without a trace on a day that seemed like any other, a Tuesday drenched in autumn rain, the kind that fills your heart with an eerie nostalgia while it washes away the colors of fall. He was just supposed to take a walk, something he often did to clear his head after long weeks buried under deadlines and obligations, but when night fell and he still hadn't returned, I felt the first tremors of fear slither through my gut. I called everyone, friends, neighbors, the local police, only for the search to yield nothing but shadows and unanswered questions. Days turned into an agonizing blur. The police treated it as a typical case of a missing adult, their sympathy waning with every passing hour. I took to wandering the woods behind our house, the place where my father loved to escape, heart pounding as I called his name into a catalogue of trees shrouded in endless fog, waiting for an echo that never came. I found myself retracing his footsteps, anxiety settling in my stomach as the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. And then I saw it, a fracture in the trees, an area where the growth seemed thinner, almost intentional, and there, lying in the damp earth was a hand-carved wooden figure of a man. It was grotesque and beautiful all at once, but more unsettling was the chill that crept up my spine, whispering that this was a sign, a distorted reflection of my father's absence. I didn't share anything about my discovery with my mother. She was already lost in her dark cloud of worry, the kind that makes every meal taste like sawdust, every laugh feel hollow. It wasn't until the days blurred into a grim cycle of hopelessness that I decided to take action, to find him before the whispers in the wind morphed into screams. I armed myself with courage, or perhaps foolishness, and a flashlight, determined to unearth the mystery I had stumbled upon with that wooden figure. As dusk rolled in, swallowing the day whole, I returned to the woods, the shadows crawling up to greet me as I turned on my flashlight and ventured deeper than ever. The trees felt like they were reaching for me, twisting in unnatural ways, as if trying to warn me. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth mixed with a sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn, and just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon an unmistakable clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient, yet something about the way its roots twisted and coiled looked almost intentional, almost inviting as though they craved something. That's when I saw it again, the figure, this time not carved from wood but fashioned from something more horrific, something that made bile rise in my throat. It was formed from branches and leaves woven tightly together, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was not just that, it had something human beneath the foliage, a shape too familiar, too large, shrouded in darkness. My heart raced, I screamed out for my father, but the only response was the whisper of leaves brushing against each other like gossiping phantoms. As I reached out, shaking with dread, I felt a compulsion to peel away the layers of branches hugging the figure. With shaking hands, I started tugging at the leaves, terror clawing at my insides, and as the last piece fell away, my breath caught in my throat, for the figure was unmistakably my father, or what was left of him, a hollow shell, lifeless yet eerily preserved in the fabric of the forest. This was no accident, this was a design born from something dark, something deeply rooted in this very place. My tears blurred the unforgiving outline of his face as I fell to my knees, the reality of loss suffocating me. I crawled backward, heart pounding furiously, yet the woods shifted, closing in around me, and when I turned to run, I felt them, the roots tangling around my ankles, pulling me down with an unrelenting grip. I screamed, thrashing, but it felt futile. The forest roared with its treachery, and I was merely a pawn in its game. It was then that I understood, this wasn't merely a forest, it was a being hungry for sorrow, for despair, weaving the threads of humanity into its ghastly tapestry. Today is probably going to be the day it ends, and as the darkness muddied my vision, I knew that my tired spirit would soon be claimed, joining my father within the haunting web of that sinister oak. The soles of my shoes slipped against the damp earth, and with one final scream, I felt myself falling, swallowed whole by the roots that sought to claim me, and as I descended into darkness, I could only hope that no one would ever uncover the truth of what lay hidden in those woods, for it had already taken too much, and part of my weary heart remained, waiting to be lost forever in the long, echoing silence of that unholy place.
I never considered myself a bad friend, but the day I snapped at Jenna, my pregnant best friend, turned my life upside down. It started innocently enough. Jenna was over for the 4th time that week, her foot swollen like a cantaloupe, her back aching from all the weight she was carrying, and to be fair, the complaints were unending. Each time she plopped down on the couch, it was like an exorcism of woes, the nausea, the cravings that went unfulfilled, and her desperate need for a foot rub. I could empathize. Pregnancy was undoubtedly hard, but each session felt like I was hearing the same horror story on repeat. By the time she showed up on that fateful Friday evening, I was exhausted from a week of late shifts and even later coffee. As she sank into her supportive pillows, I braced myself for another round of grievances, and that's when it happened. "I just want one day where I don't feel like a beached whale," she lamented, and something inside me snapped. It wasn't even the comment itself, but the way her eyes glazed over as she spoke, like she was on autopilot, repeating the same verses in a never-ending song of misery. I'd had it. I turned to her, feeling my chest tightening with frustration, and said, "Jenna, I can't stand your complaining anymore. You're pregnant, yes, but you have to find joy in this somewhere, right? I get that it's hard, but damn it, other people have it worse than you." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The laughter we had shared moments before died, her smile fading into a tight line, and silence enveloped the room like a cold blanket. I thought she'd laugh it off or throw a pillow at me, but instead, she just stared. Her reaction was haunting, her disappointment scalding, and for the first time, I sensed a dark shadow looming over our friendship. She muttered something that got lost in the tension before getting up and leaving, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing like a gunshot. At first, guilt gnawed at me. Had I been heartless? But then came ask you comfort, a whisper in my ear that maybe my words held some truth. The next day, a part of me expected her to text, to berate me or demand an apology, but nothing came. Days turned into a week, and I could feel the silence stretching like a taut string, almost ready to snap. When I did reach out, she'd answer but with the stiffness of a stranger. What hurt most were the glimpses of social media. I could see her struggles, the photos of swelling feet, cradling hands, but none of it felt real anymore. It was like watching a staged production where I had been written out of existence. Part of me felt relieved, thinking this space would allow her to regroup, but deep down, dread nagged at my core. Then, on a particularly lonely evening, just as I was about to drown myself in Netflix and Ben & Jerry's, a text from her lit my screen. "Can we talk?" My pulse quickened. I felt sick but also exhilarated. I agreed and mentally prepared for the storm. She arrived, and I noted the weariness etched on her face, shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," she started, voice wavering. "About what you said." Panic prickled my spine, but she continued. "I've tried to conceal my struggle because everyone tells me I should be joyful, I should be glowing, but I'm not. I'm drowning, and I thought you, of all people, would understand." I opened my mouth to apologize, realizing she wasn't just pleading for sympathy, but begging for a lifeline. I could see it now, all of it, the internal battle she fought, the guilt of not experiencing the serene bliss of motherhood while others sang its praises. But as I awkwardly fumbled with my words, it was clear all that came out was a mix of trembling apologies and half-hearted reassurances. I wanted to lift her burden, but the weight was too much for both of us, and just when I felt like we might connect, she dropped a bomb. I had a dream about you, you know. Last night. Darkness washed over her expression, twisting reality into something grotesque, and my heart sank as she recounted a visceral dream of a shadow that had pulled her into a hall of crooked mirrors, and there, in every reflection, I stood, grinning, unfeeling, as she writhed beneath the surface. My skin prickled. It felt so real, Jen. Like you were watching me suffer, and you didn't care. The moonlight pooled through her window as her voice softened. You became the thing that haunted me. I tried to explain how I was just worn out too, but looked into her eyes and froze. I saw desperation, yes, but lurking beneath was something darker, something that felt like loss more than just disappointment. Then I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a weight in the air that made my breath catch. Something was coming. The power flickered then dimmed, leaving us awash in darkness, and I glanced around, heart racing as I felt it, a presence at the edge of the room, chilling and heavy, wrapping itself around our fears. Jenna, I whispered, panic creeping back into my voice, but before I could even turn back to her, I felt an icy grip on my wrist. The last thing I saw before the shadows overwhelmed us was Jenna's eyes, wide and terrified, no longer filled with sorrow but pure dread, as she mouthed a word, help. It was in that moment, amidst a palpable darkness, I realized that my inadvertent cruelty had unleashed something far more menacing than either of us could comprehend, and as the darkness closed in, I understood, we weren't just fighting between us, we were wrestling with the very horrors we had conjured, each complaint, each thought twisting into the shadows waiting to consume us whole.
I don't get close to people anymore, it seems. That's fine. It wasn't always this way. I used to be sociable, full of laughter and enthusiasm, weaving friendships into the fabric of my lonely life, until that summer when everything changed. It began innocently enough, with a benign connection to a secluded online forum dedicated to true crime. I loved hearing about the twisted tales of murder and betrayal, but one thread caught my eye, a chilling discussion about a local urban legend, the puppeteer of Hollow Creek. It was said that he would befriend lonely souls, drawing them into his web before stealing their lives away, leaving behind nothing but hollow shells. Skeptical yet intrigued, I monitored the thread as people recounted their encounters, dismissing them as mere horror stories crafted for entertainment. Until I stumbled upon a post that hit too close to home. A user described how they met the puppeteer at a local cafe. They were alone, drawn in by his charm and the affection he so easily feigned. It was during a sleepless night when I regrettably decided to reply, sharing my own sense of isolation and my overwhelming anxiety about connecting with others. That was my first mistake. Hours passed with no response, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that it was just digital noise, until the first message came in. "You're not alone anymore." It sent a chill racing down my spine. Curious, I clicked on the user's profile, and my blood ran cold. There were no details, no posts. Just the eerie username, Puppeteer. I tried to ignore it, but for the next few days, I received messages that felt too personal, too invasive, almost like he was watching me. I deleted my account, thinking I could escape, but the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes trailing my every move, never left. I noticed strange figures lurking on the edges of my vision, disappearing the moment I'd turned to look. I stopped leaving my house, hiding away. Weeks turned into months of solitude, and I convinced myself it was better to be lonely than to risk meeting someone like him. Besides, safety was found in solitude, I kept telling myself, and that's fine. Then one evening, a knock echoed through my apartment, sharp and unsettling. I froze, breath hitching as my heart raced. Glancing through the peephole, I saw a figure standing in the dim light, elegantly dressed, the contours of his face obscured by shadow. My blood ran cold as I recognized the silhouette. It looked just like the vague details the users had posted when recounting their encounters with the puppeteer. Panic surged through me, flooding my senses. I scrambled back from the door, phone in hand, ready to call the police when the figure began to speak, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that wound around my thoughts like a vice. "I can help you. You don't have to be alone." I dropped my phone, dread tumbling through me as he continued, "I see you. I know that you're lonely. Just let me in." His words were laced with an almost hypnotic quality, clawing at my fears and insecurities, tempting me to relinquish my solitude. I wanted to turn away, to find solace in the idea that I could shield myself, but the longing for connection began to bubble to the surface as I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. "You think I don't know what you need?" His voice was like velvet, seductive yet ominous, slithering into my mind. "The things that frighten you are the very things that can set you free. Hidden in darkness, I know the truth." He paused then, and the silence that stretched between us felt palpable, suffocating. "I can show you." My resolve shattered, and without thinking, I unlatched the door, my hand trembling as I pulled it open just a crack. He stood there, eyes twinkling with a predatory glint, and the moment our eyes locked, I felt an odd warmth. My brain raced, wondering if maybe I'd made a mistake, or if, against all odds, he was telling the truth. "Come play with me," he said, and with a smile that looked like a dark promise, I stepped through the threshold. I barely took notice of the world around me as he led me outside into the moonlit night, and for what felt like the first time in years, I felt exhilarated. He guided me deeper into the woods that bordered my neighborhood, the trees looming like ancient sentinels surrounding us, and as we walked, he spoke of his collection, an archive of fears and delights intertwined, shadows moving like marionettes in the corners of my vision. There was magic in his words, a twisted enchantment that unraveled the very fabric of my past loneliness, but with each step, the laughter grew faint, and my heart pounded with dread. He stopped by a clearing illuminated by flickering lanterns that cast long shadows, revealing a stage dressed in vibrant colors, a world alive with twisted whimsy. I was drawn in, entranced by the performance he was putting on, a grotesque display of people whose absences seemed to linger even in the air. Their laughter was empty, their faces as pale as bone, reflecting a lifetime of moments forever stolen. And in that instant, the charm slipped, realization crashed upon me like a wave. I wasn't simply experiencing a show, I was witnessing the fate of those who had come before, the hollow echoes of lost connections. I watched as he reached for me, a smile stretched across his face, and I stumbled backward, trying to retreat from the horror before me. But it was too late, the puppeteer's strings had already taken hold, weaving into my veins like an intoxicating poison. Suddenly, the air shifted, and I felt an unbearable sense of dread as shadows danced around us, whispering secrets of those he had taken, locking them in this forsaken place. The laughter turned into screams, a cacophony of despair that filled the night. In my moment of panic, I ran, pushing through the trees, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon me as I fled, the sounds of his laughter trailing me like a haunting melody that twisted my insides. I stumbled through the woods, disoriented, my heart a drum in my chest until I finally broke free, emerging into the familiar stretch of my neighborhood. Then silence enveloped me, heavy and oppressive, and I thought I was safe, until I turned, finally breathing in relief, only to find the puppeteer standing at the edge of the trees, face illuminated by the moonlight, a ghostly grin dancing across his lips. "You can't escape who you are," he called out, his voice echoing like a phantom, and I realized in that harrowing moment, I would never truly be free. The seeds of my loneliness had taken root, and he had promised he would always be there, waiting just out of sight. I don't get close to people anymore it seems, and that's fine. It's less painful to exist in the shadows of my own making than to risk feeling something that could only lead to an inevitable descent into darkness, so I stay alone, weaving my own threads, knowing the puppeteer always watches, lurking on the periphery of my life, reminding me that the moment I mistake isolation for safety, I may find those very shadows dancing all too close. I flashed an old lady at the grocery store today, and before you get any twisted ideas, let me clarify, it wasn't intentional, and it wasn't what you think. I was just trying to grab a bag of flour from the top shelf when I lost my grip and the whole thing came tumbling down. The bag exploded at my feet, sending a plume of white powder into the air like a volcanic eruption of baking needs, clouds enveloping me and leaving everything in a soft, eerie fog. When the dust settled, I found myself standing amidst a scene that could only be described as chaos, flour blanketing the ground, my mouth tasting like I had swallowed an entire bag of pancake mix, and the shocked gasps mixed with stifled laughter echoing through the aisles. That's when I turned to see her, an elderly lady, standing just a few feet away, her jaw dropped and eyes wide in disbelief or maybe disgust. For a split second, I imagined that my embarrassing moment was simply a benign encounter, harmless and funny in its own right. I was still chuckling at the absurdity of it all when I caught sight of the expression on her face as she stared at my flour-coated shirt and the explosion remnants surrounding me. Just as I was about to apologize, she opened her mouth, and what came out sent a chill through my spine. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice low yet steady, each word slow and deliberate. It seemed impossible to connect that expression with anything else. It felt almost ominous, like she wasn't speaking about the flower but something much deeper. I took a step back, feeling a crawling sensation creeping up my skin, and suddenly taking another one felt like a mistake. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. Her eyes, once filled with amusement, now held something darker, a knowing glance that sparked the most primal of fears within me. It was unsettling, how she positioned her hand against the cart, her knuckles clenching tight around the handle, and the grocery list hanging limply from her wrinkled fingers. I turned to leave, thinking maybe if I just ignored the whole incident, it would go away, but she spoke again, her voice like syrup pouring over a wound. "They're watching you," she warned, and that was it. My heart raced, my instinct screamed to flee, but I felt like I was anchored to the ground, a bizarre mix of curiosity and dread rooting me in place. I scanned the store for anyone staring, but everyone else was wrapped up in their own worlds. Then her finger pointed past me, and I turned just in time to see a tall figure lurking at the end of the aisle. Shadows danced around him, twisting his features enough that I couldn't make out any details. But the cold sweat that erupted on my skin froze me in place. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the old lady's stark warning. Was I imagining things? Was this a setup for some hidden camera prank show? The figure began to move closer, dread clenching my stomach as I frantically took stock of the situation. You would think that I'd run, arms flailing like a madman, but instead, I found myself standing there like a deer in headlights, unable to process why I didn't just walk away from this bizarre confrontation. The old lady chuckled softly, then her laugh turned into a croak like something ugly unfolding inside her. "Please, don't hurt him," she said, her eyes suddenly glistening with tears, and that inexplicable fear rose again. I wasn't sure if the figure was friend or foe, whether it was some gimmick from the universe aimed at punishing me for my earlier embarrassment. I twisted away, ready to bolt from this bizarre scene, but as I took a step, she reached out and touched my forearm with surprising strength for someone who seemed so frail, holding me there, anchoring me to this terrifying loop of uncertainty. "You'll find him again," she whispered, each word curling into my ear like smoke, and something about her tone suggested that, deep down, she believed it. Goosebumps erupted on my skin, and her grip tightened as if she might force something out of me, something evil or something true, but I was lost in the panic of it all. In my head, all I could think about was escape, but I glanced over at the figure again and realized they weren't coming toward me anymore. They turned and started walking away, blending into the shadows as if they were nothing more than a lost dream. But the old woman wouldn't let go. "You'll understand soon." "The flower," she whispered again, and before I could comprehensively think about what she had said, I yanked my arm loose and sprinted down the aisle. I could hear her faint laughter lingering behind me, growing louder, echoing like a haunting tune as I raced toward the exit. Outside, the sun was shining bright. The normalcy of it seemed to clash violently with the madness I had just encountered. I hurried to my car, fumbling to unlock it as images from that strange encounter licked at the edges of my focus. I screamed at myself internally to calm down as I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so much I nearly dropped the keys. I couldn't shake off what she'd said, her ominous warning embedded in my mind like a tattoo that refused to fade. And still, as I sat in my car, I glanced over to the entrance of the store, and that figure was standing there again, their back turned to me, and an unmistakable chill slithered down my spine. The old lady's laughter echoed in my head, and a new realization flashed through me. She wasn't just talking about the flower, she was referring to something more profound, something related to the figure that I was sure I'd never laid eyes on before. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, but the moment I turned the key to the ignition, I could swear I had caught snippets of her laughter echoing through the fabric of reality itself. It twisted like a blend of innocence lost in somber tones, and even with the engine sputtering to life, I felt the suffocating grip of a haunting truth tightening around my chest. I needed to get away from that store, away from that figure, away from her bizarre grip of prophecy, but even now as I drive home, with every mile, I could feel the insidious gnawing that this was only the beginning of something far more twisted, that maybe my mundane embarrassment would spiral and reconnect with something darker lurking behind the ordinary. And I hated the sinking feeling that I would find myself reliving this moment if I wasn't careful. I didn't know how, but that old lady's words echoed like an untouchable truth, promising that I would soon uncover the real reason I shouldn't have done what I did today. I am under the influence of cannabis probably 15 out of 24 hours a day. Every day. Initially, it was just a way to cope with the noise, the chaos of an urban life that seemed to drown out any semblance of peace. I started with small puffs shared among friends, laughter spilling into the sultry summer evenings like the smoke that curled above us, but I soon slipped down a rabbit hole of dependence, craving the blissful haze that separated me from the world and my relentless thoughts. Somehow, each day began to blend into the next, an endless loop of green euphoria that dulled any emotional edge, and soon enough, it morphed from joy to a daily ritual. I lost count of how many times I lit up before breakfast, the smell of burnt herb mingling with eggs and coffee, and that warm, fuzzy embrace wrapped around me like a blanket, lulling me into a sweet stupor that I convinced myself was normal. My reflection began to change, the vibrant hues of life fading to a dull pastel that echoed the smoke spiraling above my head. Friends fell away, too, one by one, their laughter replaced by concerned glances as I sank deeper into this comforting cocoon, dismissing their worries with a casual wave, clutching my pipe like a talisman. I began to drift into thoughts that felt disjointed and strange, arguments with the voices in my head that grew louder in the stillness, their insistence piercing through the thick cloud that enveloped me. They whispered darkly, filled with scorn, reminding me of every missed opportunity and every shred of ambition I had allowed to wilt in favor of this sluggish existence, and in that distorted haze, I felt myself fraying. At night, when the world outside grew still beneath the blanket of midnight, the whispers morphed into something else entirely. They transformed into figures, cloaked in shadows that loomed just at the edge of my peripheral vision, feeling more tangible with each drag I took. My apartment became a labyrinth of unfamiliar faces and fleeting fears mingled with sweet cannabis dreams, and I could no longer discern if they were real or merely figments of my mind, a manifestation of my guilt and isolation. Simple tasks like showering and eating became monumental challenges, overtaken by the thrum of dread that pulsed beneath the surface, awakening once I extinguished my joint. I began to avoid mirrors, fearful of acknowledging the hollow-eyed stranger who inhabited my body. Friends stopped visiting, replaced by a parade of drifters I'd invite over in search of human connection, but soon realized they shared the same haze, their laughter echoing hollowly in the darkness of my mind. One rainy Thursday, the sky wept in tune with my thoughts, a perfect reflection of my internal turmoil, and I sank deeper into my sofa, convinced I had become invisible beneath the swirling clouds of my own making. It wasn't until the tapping began, a light knock one night, that startled me from the warm embrace of my weed fog, echoing through the silence of my apartment. At first, I dismissed it, chalking it up to my wild imagination, swirling shadows in the corners, but the knocking persisted, steady and unrelenting, as if someone stood outside my door quietly pleading for entry. Heart racing, I cowered into my sofa, focused on the relentless sound, sweat pooling at my brow while my mind prepared to fall deeper into the rabbit hole. Each knock grew louder, urging me to confront whatever was out there, but dread knew me well by this point, wrapping around my throat, choking the courage from my chest. Anxiety bloomed within me. It could be the police, or worse, a former friend come to confront me about my spiraling addiction, but when I finally mustered the strength to peek through the peephole, I recoiled. The figure outside was gaunt and twisted, with an impossibly elongated face that bore a crooked grin, yet it looked unsettlingly familiar. It was an uncanny echo of myself, but hollowed, eyes sunken deep into its skull, staring at me with an unsettling hunger. I stumbled back, grabbing my stash in a panic at the sight of that ethereal monstrosity and the horrific realization that perhaps I had become a charred reflection of my true self, everything that I had loved stripped away. I sprinted to the window, desperate to escape reality as I methodically rolled the spliff to soothe the panic rising in my chest, but as I inhaled deeply and the smoke rose, so did a flood of faces, those long-gone friends circling my consciousness with pity and disgust, their laughter echoing hauntingly as they faded into my mind's eye. Just as I thought I might choke on the smoke, I caught a glimpse of a flicker outside the window, and there it was again, that familiar face looming outside, pulling on my heartstrings, gasping for life as the shadows thrummed and twisted. In a daze of panic, I grasped my phone, fumbling to call for help, desperate to shatter this web of psyche and reclaim what was left of me, but the screen wouldn't illuminate. The faces outside were swarming now, reaching out with elongated fingers, and all at once, the porch light flickered and went out. I could hear whispers resounding all around me, beckoning, pleading with a voice that sounded so much like my own, begging me to join them in their suffocating embrace. I crushed my spliff against the edge of the table, smoke curling around me, and as I contemplated whether I'd lost my mind entirely or if there was still a flicker of the person I used to be trapped inside the haze, the knuckles rapped once more against my door with a finality I could no longer take. The door trembled under the weight of my fears, pressing against the fragile wall between me and that grotesque reflection of myself, and as I felt the darkness closing in, a sickening certainty washed over me, I was neither alive nor dead, I was forever suspended in between, hidden under the influence of my own devices. It's been 20 years and I still can't stop loving her, but it's not the kind of love that fills your heart with warmth and joy. No, this is something tattered and twisted, a consuming force that claws at my soul, and it all began when I was just 17, that fateful autumn evening when Clara walked into my life like a specter rising from the fog. She had that old soul charm, a vintage dress that danced around her ankles, and wild curls that glinted like stars caught in her hair, and as we spent those late nights whispering secrets, our fingers grazing, I felt an electric connection, one that turned into a swift whirlwind romance, a summer of stolen kisses and laughter. But then came that fateful day when everything changed. Clara's laughter became fractured as her shadows deepened, and I learned too late that she'd been hiding something dark, a family curse that entwined with her blood. She would disappear for days, lost in the depths of her own mind, and each time she returned, there was less of her to hold, like sand slipping through my fingers, until I discovered she wasn't just running from herself, something was chasing her, something in the corners of our small towns and darkened alleys, something ancient that whispered her name on cold nights. I called it a curse, but later I realized I had underestimated its power. It wasn't merely supernatural, it was a living, breathing entity that wanted her, that hungered for her essence, and I was powerless to stop it. On that night, the night of the harvest moon, it all crescendoed. Clara had pulled away from me entirely, her eyes fogged with a darkness that made the world around her fade into the background, and despite my pleas, she vanished into the woods, chased by her demons, leaving only a will-o'-the-wisp glow behind. I followed desperately, my heart racing, adrenaline pumping, calling her name until my voice was hoarse, until I was knee-deep in mud and weeds, but the moon hung heavy and mocking above, and just as I thought I'd lost her forever, I found her in a clearing where the air crackled with a demonic energy, where shadows twisted into shapes of creatures I couldn't comprehend, all gathered like spectators, and Clara knelt on the forest floor, eyes wide, empty, and in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just losing Clara, she was transforming, surrounded by the darkness that had clawed and grown for her for so long. It was surreal, watching the love of my life become something else entirely, a halo of bitter light surrounding her, begging me to save her, but all I did was stand frozen, a frightful witness to the horror unfolding before me as she succumbed to the power drawing her, and when the echoes of her laughter turned into wails of anguish, I knew my heart was tearing apart. I reached for her, desperate to pull her back, but she was already slipping away, swallowed by a haze of shadows that drank from her essence, and with each cry, each shard of my soul ripped away, a voice resonated deep within me, whispering that this was it, this was the price of love bound in darkness. When the glowing ceased, the forest was silent, and all that remained was a chilling sense of emptiness, but even as I stumbled back home, paralyzed by grief, I never had a moment's doubt that she was still alive. I was certain she was somewhere, still fighting, still struggling against the chains forged from her very blood. As years turned into decades, I found myself captivated by the menacing specter of the past, replaying that night in my mind like a broken record, and though my heart became a twisted caricature of love, each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, I returned to the clearing, expecting to feel her presence, hoping for a sign, breathing in the air thick with desperation. I decorated the spot with wildflowers, lighting candles and whispering her name like a prayer, convinced the darkness that took her could somehow return her to me, but all I got in return were the echoes and memory, the stale warmth of memories tainted by her absence until one fateful night, after what felt like an eternity of longing, I was jolted from my reverie. It was late, and the fog rolled into the clearing thick and heavy, transforming the place into a damp, otherworldly realm, and as I set the candles ablaze, a chill seized me, the air quivering with a familiar heartbeat as if it knew I was there, and for a moment I was overwhelmed by the scent of her perfume, a reminder of nights wrapped in her embrace. Elation and dread battled within me as shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, and then there she was, ethereal and luminous, Clara, emerging from the mist, but she was not the girl I remembered, her smile was absent, her eyes lacked the warmth, and the shadowy energy flickered around her like flames, mesmerizing yet terrifying. "You were supposed to forget," she whispered, her voice like fragile glass, cutting through me, and every word was a stab in the heart as I felt the truth. I was not seeing the love of my life, I was gazing at a hollow stranger draped in her form, a futile figment of all that had vanished, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. My love had become a cruel reflection, and I reached for her, aching to pull her close, but as my fingers grazed her skin, a jolt surged through me, a searing touch that felt alien, and it struck me how much she had changed, how she was intertwined with the darkness now. "You shouldn't have come back," she breathed, and I could hear the sorrow in her voice woven with menace. But I didn't care. I loved her still, I would always love her. I never stopped, I managed to say, hope spilling from my lips, but before I could take another breath, the shadows surrounding her reached out like icy tendrils, wrapping themselves around my wrist as she took a step back, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. She was backing away into the depths of that darkness that had always claimed her, the gulf widening, and the air grew thick with despair until it felt almost solid. "I can't go back," she cried, and in that moment, I saw the real Clara glimmering through the cracks of that darkened shell. "You have to let me go," she urged, but the desperation clawed at my throat, each heartbeat louder and more frantic. "No. I can't. I won't," I shouted, the words spilling out of me like blood from an open wound, but she was already sliding further away, as if the shadows were pulling her back like tendrils from another world, and I realized, too late, that I couldn't save her. In that fraught moment, I learned love wasn't enough to conjure her back to life, nor would it ever be. Then, the shadows erupted, transforming into a storm of darkness, swallowing her entirely, and I was left standing alone in the clearing, breathless, trembling, crying out in anguish as the echoes finally fell to silence. The candles flickered one last time before snuffing out, and as I sunk to my knees, I finally understood. It had been 20 years of hell, missing her, yearning for her, but now the realization seeped into my bones that it was too late. Clara was gone forever, consumed by the darkness she had battled, while I was left with the heavy burden of this twisted, lingering love that would never release its grip, binding me endlessly to the pain of her absence, forcing me to survive in a world that felt dreadfully bleak without her light. I'll never forget the night everything changed, how something so ordinary transformed into something haunted by a darkness I never saw coming. It all started when my friend with benefits, Jess, invited me over to her place after a long week of classes and work, and obviously, I was eager to unwind, to lose myself momentarily in the comfort of our arrangement that was free of strings but filled with heat and laughter. We settled onto her couch, the air thick with tension as we exchanged playful banter, and I thought about how well I knew her, the way her hair cascaded down her back, the mischievous glint in her eyes, the way she made my skin prick with anticipation. When she suggested we take it to the bedroom, I could hardly contain my excitement. However, in the back of my mind that night, I felt something strange. The house was uncharacteristically quiet, too quiet, as if the walls were listening, holding their breath. Our usual routine quickly escalated, and the thrill of the moment took over as we lost ourselves in a whirlwind of passion, the world around us fading until it was just us, breathing hard under the dim glow of her bedside lamp. In a moment of pure adrenaline, as I leaned forward, my hand braced awkwardly against the edge of the bed, the weight of my body shifted unexpectedly, and I heard a snapping sound, a sharp, sickening crack, that echoed like a low thunderclap within the confines of that intimate space. Pain exploded through my arm, the kind of agony that makes you question every decision that led to that moment, and through the haze of shock, I glanced down to see my forearm at an unnatural angle, the skin stretched tight against the bone, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as I processed what just happened, while Jess gasped in horror, her playful demeanor dissolving into panic. She rushed to my side, her hands trembling against my skin as I struggled to breathe, each gasp turning into a low whimper as I fought against the pain coursing through me, and when I looked up at her, her face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of concern and disbelief, and all I could think was how this wasn't how nights like this were supposed to go, how intimacy at its rawest turned into this twisted nightmare. The sound of sirens pierced the air minutes later as Jess called for help, her voice shaking as she tried to keep it together while my world faded in and out, the edges of my vision darkening with every passing moment. They took me to the hospital, and there I lay, alone in a sterile room, wincing as they carefully aligned my broken arm, the dull throb contrasting sharply with the chaos of my racing heart. Hours later, when I was discharged, I could only think about how Jess must have been affected by all of this, how something so innocent and intimate could suddenly carry with it an unshakable weight. I returned home, my arm hanging limply in a makeshift sling, but the real torment came in the days that followed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that in the midst of my pain, I'd somehow summoned a darkness that lurked just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to creep in. Jess texted me later that week, concerned about how I was holding up, but I could hear the hesitance in her words, as if our connection had fractured alongside my arm, and the nights dragged on, filled with nightmares of shadows dancing at the edge of my perception. On one particularly restless night, I found myself pacing my living room, the broken silence pressing in on me, a feeling that something was standing just behind me, lurking in the half-light. My phone buzzed, and it was Jess again, this time asking if we could talk, her voice trembling with an urgency that sent my heart racing. I sensed a change in her tone, a gravity that pulled my stomach tight as she begged me to meet her. When I arrived at her place the next day, I found the front door slightly ajar, panic unfurling in my chest as I entered. The house felt cold, a stark contrast to the warm bubble we had created before, and as I called out her name, an unsettling silence answered, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. I ventured deeper into the house and into her bedroom, where the familiar scent of her perfume danced in the air. On the walls hung pictures of us, smiles frozen in time, but something about the images felt distorted, sinister. The shadows behind us were darker than I remembered, and something within me whispered that those moments we had shared had morphed into something altogether different. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that felt otherworldly, and fear clawed at my throat as I fumbled for the handle, desperately pulling, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed a figure in the corner, someone standing in the murkiness with a silhouette too skewed to truly make out. My heart raced as I stumbled back, breath coming in shallow gasps, and the figure stepped forward, a tall, gaunt creature with Jess's face but vacant eyes, utterly devoid of warmth and familiarity, a reflection of the dark energy that had seeped into our lives since that fateful night. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, the sound twisting in my ears like a knife, and before I could comprehend it, the thing lunged at me, a whirlwind of shadows and despair. I barely managed to dodge as it tackled the space where I'd stood, crashing into the wall with a violent thud, and I bolted toward the door, adrenaline surging through me, the panic of never escaping this torment twisting my gut tighter. The handle finally yielded to my desperate grabbing, and I flung myself into the hallway, gasping for air, but all I could think was how every laugh we'd shared morphed into premonitions of something terrible, how every passionate moment had left an imprint too deep to wash away, as the memories of our best times now haunted me like a relentless specter. I never saw Jess again after that night. Never heard her voice or saw her smile, and it took weeks to piece my life back together. But every single day was tainted with the echo of that moment, the house, the figure, the sense that I had breached a dark undercurrent that lay just below the surface of our lives. The broken arm healed, but the fractures in my reality stayed, unshakable reminders of a connection that was never meant to be, a pact of twisted fate forged in the heat of passion that spiraled into an abyss I could never understand. Even now, as I recount this tale, the shadows gather at the edges of my life, and I dread the moment they might finally consume me whole. I never thought a simple layover would turn into a nightmare, but it started innocuously enough. My flight from New York to Los Angeles had been delayed, the news echoing through the terminal like a death knell for my plans, and before I knew it, I was pacing past the bars, the smooth hum of low conversations and the clink of ice in glasses enticing me like a siren's call. So I sat, ordering a whiskey sour just to take the edge off the frustration, telling myself I'd only have one to calm my nerves, but each taste of that sweetly bitter concoction pulled me deeper. And by the third drink, I was already starting to feel the buzz, which turned into a heady high within an hour, and the world around me morphed into something surreal. People laughed too loudly, announcements buzzed like angry flies, and the neon lights of the bar blended into one dazzling blur. I barely noticed when they called my flight for boarding, but a sinking feeling in my gut prompted me to check my watch just to see the numbers rush past me like spilled ink, a mere few minutes late, and when I stumbled through the gate, the attendant's angry finger wagging in the air told me I was too late, though I'd swear I caught a glimpse of the jet's wing jutting out from the window, mocking me from the tarmac. I spent the next hour slumped at the bar, furiously downing another drink and lamenting my bad luck, just breathing life into my sorrows like pouring whiskey over ice, until I should have learned my lesson. But that happy haze, that optically distorted sense of time and reality pushed me to pull out my phone to rebook, and before I knew it, I was looking at the next flight, feeling pride swell in my chest as I tapped the screen, thinking if I calmed down, I could meet my friends in California, still be part of the fun. But patience was not on my side. I continued to sip, and laugh with strangers, forging connections powered by our collective misery of missed connections and sticky floors, each round erasing all sense of responsibility I should have felt, until my world turned upside down once again when the screen flashed with a warning of the next flight boarding. Again I checked the time, this time racing to gather my things. Desperate and giddy, all at once, like the chaos of a soldier preparing for battle, knowing full well I was stepping into a battlefield of anxiety. But, heaven help me, I was hammered, too far gone to process my mistakes. I stumbled through the terminal, dodging a small child and some businessman with a briefcase that seemed like an apparition caught in my peripheral. My heart was racing, a pounding thrill feeding into my drunken courage, and in the moment of oblivion, when I reached the gate, exhaling relief, I lifted my head only to be met with a stony-faced attendant, That same accusatory finger out like lightning pointed straight at me, implying I was a fool for even dreaming it possible to join them once again. I cursed, with such vivid clarity I shocked myself, saying things I shouldn't in public while the others stared or snickered at my disarray of both appearance and manner, the last remaining shred of what was once my dignity lost somewhere among the tables and bars that grinned at me through the haze. With this stunned realization igniting my senses, I called after the departing flight, desperation clawing through my mind. But it was no use, the plane disappeared, leaving me alone and shaking in a terminal I had begun to despise, punctuated only by the heavy thumping of my heart and an impending sense of doom. My sense of self crumbling under the weight of staggering embarrassment. Finally, as the alcohol settled into a dull numbness, I trudged back to the bar, the only constant in the swirling chaos, and ordered another drink, trying to talk myself into an acceptance of my fate. After all, it was just one day, right? But with each sip, a primal panic slithered across my skin, a nagging thought urging me to leave, to run away, to get out and away before it all consumed me, and despite the ache in my head and the bitterness clawing at my throat, I hesitated, glancing up at the flickering lights overhead, and that's when everything changed. As the light flickered again, shadows began to stretch, elongating across the floor, pressed and pulled until they morphed into unsettling shapes, what appeared to be figures, with faces half melted, eyes drooping and mouths wide, as if screaming but no sound reaching my ears. My heart raced, panic igniting every nerve, clawing at me like something alive, and as I felt their gaze seeping into my skin, I dropped the glass at my feet, its shattering echoing in the silence, only amplifying the feeling that I wasn't alone, like they were here for me, locked in a malevolent dance that threatened to engulf me. Yet as I stumbled back, trying to escape this twisted tableau, somehow the chaos around faded away, swallowed by an inexplicable stillness. The bustling airport dimmed and all noise hushed, leaving just me and them, figures that lurked, looming just out of reach, smiling cruelly, beckoning me, and as I turned to run, my legs felt like jelly, my heart thundering in my ears, yet the horrors didn't relent. They chased me through the terminal, the world around me a cherry red warning sign, the faces mounting as if they fed off my terror, urging me into some dark labyrinth I couldn't comprehend. And when I finally reached the exit, gasping for breath, grasping at the handle of the sliding door, a solid shiver gripped my spine as I realized the outside wasn't filled with bright sunshine and promise, but sheer darkness, a smog that seemed to swirl and breathe. And just as I turned back to scream for help, they were upon me, a swarm of whispers drowning my voice, and in that heartbeat, I disappeared from the world once more, never to clutch my dreams of California, my soul stuck in limbo between two missed flights, a drunken mistake on a forgotten day, lost forever to the shadows of my choices.
I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all too familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: if you can't make it on time, don't come at all. When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student. But I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. Just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun. Yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master, realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. Ever since my parents divorced, family gatherings had started morphing into tense affairs, but nothing could have prepared me for the fallout when my dad's ex, Marla, showed up unexpectedly one rainy evening, drenched and disheveled, claiming she'd been evicted. As the thunder rumbled outside, I could feel the weight of her presence in our living room, a far cry from the woman I remembered, her usual vibrant laugh now reduced to a shaky whisper as she recounted her misfortunes to my dad, leaning heavily on the coffee table as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. I hung back in the hallway, my heart pounding. My instincts screamed that her flimsy excuses masked something darker, but my dad's sympathetic nods only fueled my unease. I knew how her charm could woo even the most skeptical, and as they discussed her dire situation, I felt something in the pit of my stomach twist. I'd heard the stories of her reckless behavior, her penchant for manipulation, and how she had once left my dad stranded in a sleazy motel with nothing but a change of clothes. My dad was generous to a fault, the kind of man who would give his last dime to someone in need, and while I admired his compassion, I worried he would fall prey to her act once again. I finally decided I couldn't remain a spectator. I stepped into the living room, my palms sweaty and my heart racing as I interrupted their conversation, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dad, we can't let her stay here." The room fell silent. Marla's eyes narrowed, simmering with an anger I had never seen directed toward me before. She quickly masked it with a feigned pout, and my dad's face twisted with confusion. "What do you mean?" "She needs help." I pressed on, my resolve hardening as I recounted her past, how she dragged him through the mud time and time again. She's not just going to use us as a safety net to escape her own choices. Instead of the agreement I had anticipated, my dad waved my words away, his disappointment cutting deeper than my rejection of Marla seemed to sting her. In a dramatic turn, she dropped her head, feigning tears, and I saw the game in the way her lower lip trembled. Are you really going to let her down? My conscience screamed as she pointedly glanced at the spare room door. I fought back the urge to argue as the storm outside intensified, matching the tortured silence in the house. It felt as if lightning would split open the very roof above us. I just need a week. Just until I get back on my feet, she pleaded, but I knew from experience that 1 week could turn into 1 month and then 1 year. The atmosphere thickened with tension. I could feel my dad wavering, torn between compassion and the realization that I was right, and it made my heart ache. I'm sorry, but I still think she should leave, I said quietly, desperate to end this stalemate. Marla pressed her lips together, rage igniting behind her eyes as if I had personally insulted her. My dad's expression turned unreadable, a mixture of disappointment and frustration swirling like the storm outside. The minute tension bubbled over when she stood up suddenly, rage burning like cold fire in her eyes as she spat out, "You're going to regret this, kid." I took a step back, the hairs on my neck standing on end, and as she stormed out of the room, I felt an unsettling chill creep in, an inclination that I had just summarized a series of escalating consequences. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marla would not simply let this go. The rain pattered on the roof gently, an eerie lullaby, but her parting words echoed violently through my mind. I tried to convince myself I had done the right thing, but deep down, a whisper niggled at me. Was I wrong to protect my space? The dread followed me into sleep, laced in vivid nightmares of lightning flashes illuminating her figure lurking outside, watching, waiting, as if planning her next move. Days turned into weeks, and the unease settled around our house like an unwelcome fog. The rain had stopped, but every time I stepped outside, the air had that charged quality, a sense of impending doom clinging to me. My fears were validated when strange things began to happen. First, it was the missing items, my favorite jacket, a set of headphones, even my car keys disappeared from plain sight. I dismissed it as misplacing them until I found a single deliberate note tucked beneath my pillow, written in a chaotic scrawl that sent shivers down my spine. Freedom isn't free. Panic began swelling in me as every day someone knocked on our door, or my phone buzzed with an unknown number only to drop to silence as I answered, the static echoing heavily in the air. My dad tried brushing off my concerns, attributing everything to paranoia, his belief in second chances overshadowing my growing dread. I could feel him slipping further from me, and Marla was utilizing that as her tool. It wasn't until one evening, out of nowhere, I found my dad pacing the living room, his expression lost and strained as he cradled the numerous eviction notices piling up on the table. When I strayed closer, glancing at the papers and unable to comprehend why they would impact us, he looked at me helplessly. She said she would help us. The final thread stretched to a breaking point. I felt the world around me collapse as gravity lost its grip. It wasn't Marla invading our home that terrified me, it was this silent truth that had woven its way into our lives like poison. I raced to my phone, dialing my dad's number with shaking hands, my own heart racing with desperation. I could hear my heart thudding against the walls of my chest like a war drum, and just then, my heart sank when I saw the screen light up minutes later with a familiar unknown number. I hesitated, every gut instinct screaming at me not to answer, but curiosity won. As I lifted the phone to my ear, that same chaotic laughter echoed through the receiver, cruel and mocking. "Didn't I tell you you'd regret it, kid?" It dawned on me, horrifyingly, just how much I had underestimated her. The line crackled with her malevolent glee, and a chill coursed through me like ice. Yet I found my voice. "What do you want?" She responded slowly, each word dripped in venom. "You owe me for all I did for your father. I'll be a part of your life whether you like it or not." I nearly dropped the phone, mouth dry as panic surged, a thousand terrible possibilities racing through my mind. That night I barricaded my bedroom door, adrenaline pumping as paranoia took hold. Each creak of the house felt sinister, it lingered like a sentient creature, watching for a moment of vulnerability. I knew she was out there, somewhere in the haze, waiting for the perfect moment to make her next move, and with that, I had everything I had wanted to regain balance slip through my fingers. Last summer, I moved into a small neighborhood where everyone seemed friendly at first, but things took a bizarre turn after I had a confrontation with my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. It all started when I casually mentioned to him, while he was washing his yard gnomes, how I preferred parking in my designated spot because it was the only small power I had in the chaos of moving into a new place. He chuckled, waving his sponge like a wand, and assured me he understood my plight. But weeks later, I got the unmistakable vibe that he didn't. Each night after work, I'd come home to find his dented old pickup parked in my spot, encroaching on my territory like a predator marking its territory. Feeling bold one evening, I knocked on his door, my heart thumping violently, and explained my frustration. He grinned wider than any normal person could, his smile stretching across his face until it felt like it threatened to split him open. "It's just a spot," he said, a hint of something darker threading through his placid demeanor, like oil slicking through water. I had to sleep on it before responding because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The following week, I returned home to find his truck occupying my space yet again, and with it, I felt a surge of familiar dread, though I couldn't quite place why. That night, a heavy storm washed over the neighborhood, accompanied by howling winds that rattled windows and sent branches skittering across the pavement. In the middle of my insomnia-fueled anxiety, I thought I heard someone tapping at my window. Peeking through the blinds, I was shocked to see Mr. Thompson standing there, drenched, his face smeared with rain and shadows, that same smile plastered on, more disturbing than ever. He called my name in this playful sing-song voice, but I swear, behind his eyes was something twisted, as if a different creature was behind them. Terrified, I yanked away from the window, hoping he'd disappear, praying for the dawn to come and that everything would just make sense again. The next morning, filled with anxiety-induced bravado, I marched back to his house to confront him fully. His wife, a ghostly figure I rarely saw, answered, her eyes glazed over as if she was looking through the world. I asked her if Mr. Thompson had come home last night, and she blinked at me, slowly, then in a flat voice said he was out working late at the greenhouse. I didn't even know he had one. Confused and feeling a sense of foreboding, I repeated the words in my head like a mantra as I took note of the strange plant-shaped shadows lurking at the edge of his yard. Days passed, and each evening he blocked my parking spot again until I snapped. I marched over, my blood hot and my hands trembling, and confronted him in front of his wife, who just stood there, slack-jawed. "You need to stop parking in my space," I shouted, the sunlight flickering through the leaves casting an eerie glow on us, and for once, Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that cut deep as if he weighed the consequence of my existence. He leaned closer, the air around him growing thick, and that's when I noticed how strange he smelled, like fresh soil and something rotten, before muttering something I couldn't comprehend, words that slithered into an unnatural hiss. I backed away slowly, hurriedly retreating home, but the very next day, I found my car's tires slashed, neatly done with the precision of a surgeon. Fear crept through me as I watched that cursed pickup parked yet again in my designated spot later that night. Deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I filed a complaint with the HOA, but nothing came of it. Apparently, they were quite fond of Mr. Thompson and had no reason to believe my story. In an act of desperate folly, I turned to social media and connected with a local group about neighborhood issues, sharing my strange, escalating situation. Surprisingly, others chimed in with their strange experiences of him. People spoke of unsettling artworks made of nature's remnants that he gifted them, of their pets going missing. The fear blossomed into something all-consuming, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that Mr. Thompson was somehow connected to the missing pets, perhaps a sacrifice to the odd, twisted plants that apparently thrived in his mysterious greenhouse. Then, on a particularly tense night, I heard rustling outside my house, followed by soft whispering. Peering outside, my stomach dropped. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing among the shadows with some others, figures I didn't recognize, as they circled something low to the ground. The dim light caught the glimmer of a long, slender object that glistened like a knife. Before I could catch my breath, they turned in unison, their expressions becoming warped, contorted mixtures of glee and malevolence, eyes shining like bleached bone, and I stumbled backward, panic spiking, the dark veil of night swallowing me whole. I resolved to end this once and for all. I waited until the next evening, finally gathering enough courage to sneak into his backyard. I needed proof. Just as I ducked beneath the overgrown vines, there it was, the greenhouse, more like a mausoleum, shrouded in darkness, where the air felt heavy with secrets. Peering through the glass, I could barely breathe. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside lay not just plants but fragments of what looked unmistakably like the missing pets, their fur woven intricately amidst the foliage in a reverent show of grotesque artistry. Bottles of dark liquid lined the shelves, and I realized I had stumbled upon something far worse than mere vengeance over a parking spot. They had turned into something sinister, a cult dedicated to reclaiming life through bizarre rituals, and suddenly, my car didn't seem like an innocent dispute anymore, it was an offering of insidious attention. I slipped back home, heart pounding in rhythm to my blind terror, attempting to rationalize what I'd seen but knowing deep down there was a price to pay. Despite my fears, I couldn't let him continue getting away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had inadvertently become the centerpiece of their twisted offering, the outsider whose boundaries they would not respect. I dug deeper into local lore and found a chilling story of disappearances linked to a green thumb that preyed on the naive and unsuspecting, a sordid tale of nature reclaiming itself through blood and bone. By the end of that cursed week, I was determined to leave, sneaking out under the cover of dawn, but when I got to my car, I saw at least 5 gnarled, vine-like tendrils creeping from beneath, wrapping around my tires and digging into the earth-like roots. Looking up, I froze in place. There was Mr. Thompson, inches away, that same smile stretched across his face, wild approval dancing in his eyes. "It's just a spot," he whispered, voice smooth and filled with eager resonance. In that moment, I understood what I'd become, just another lost soul to nourish his insatiable craving for dominance over life, held captive with the realization that the only way to escape this otherworldly nightmare would be to surrender my life as a tribute, the very sacrifice that would grant him what he sought. And as he leaned closer, inviting me deeper into the darkness, I screamed internally, realizing I was trapped in a game with no escape, with no answers. AITA for asking him not to park in my spot? It turns out that in this twisted web of existence, sometimes the rules aren't just for parking spaces, they're about survival.
I made a girl quit school and it still haunts me to this day. I can't shake the feeling that I'm to blame for everything that happened to her afterward, and the memories claw at my mind like a possessed creature. It all began during my sophomore year of high school when Emily transferred to our small town. She was shy, with soft features and dark eyes that seemed to absorb the world instead of reflect it, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she was different. At first, I tried to befriend her. My own brand of high school insecurity made me reach out, but that was before the others got wind of her arrival. Misfit kids like me always seemed to congregate around each other, and Emily quickly fell into the crosshairs of the school's most vicious clique, the ones that reveled in tearing apart anyone different. They targeted her with whispers and snickers, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air as I stood by, torn between standing up for her or wanting to fit in myself. It's easy to rationalize cowardice when you're young and terrified, but as the weeks went by, their jabs escalated into actual harassment. They would trip her in the hall, shove her books to the ground and laugh, and in a moment of weakness, I joined in, laughing along, thinking it was just harmless fun until I saw the light die in her eyes. I watched as Emily became more withdrawn, the spark in her life snuffed out, her laughter became a rare sound, and the vibrant personality I initially saw shriveled into a ghostly reminder of what might have been. One afternoon, I overheard them daring her to show up to the next party, taunting her to come and see who'd laugh at her again, and without pausing to think, I went home and crafted an anonymous note. "Don't go to the party," it read, "no one wants you there." I slipped it into her locker, a sick mix of guilt and joy coursing through me, thinking I was protecting her when really, I was burying her. When the night of the party arrived, I heard the laughter echo down the street from my window, my insides twisting as I imagined her not showing up only to feel relief as I thought at least she was safe from ridicule, safe from me, from all of it. The following week, Emily was gone, and the rumor was that her parents pulled her out of school, that she wanted nothing to do with that hellhole any longer. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but then a weight settled over my chest. I had traded a real person for my own self-preservation. I became a ghost in my own life, high school dragging on in a numbing blur of faces and grades, and the laughter of the others echoed continually in the back of my mind. Every time I faced my reflection, I could feel Emily's eyes boring into me, silently asking why I hadn't stepped in, why I hadn't fought for her when it mattered, and that's when I began to see the details I couldn't dismiss anymore. The posters in the halls started featuring her name, Emily's last day, missing person, and my heart dropped with a sickening realization. Flashes of a girl I barely knew but had played a part in shattering filled my dreams, her smile now twisted into a grimace, her dark eyes turning hollow. I told myself it was just guilt, that I could drown it out, but the whispers became louder as classmates whispered rumors about her fate. Some said she just switched schools for a fresh start, others that she had run away, but rumors morphed into something sinister in the bowels of small-town gossip and soon shifted to the idea that she had vanished into the wilderness, swallowed whole. Days turned into months as high school pulsed on, but the whisper of Emily remained. Class presentations blurred into feelings of dread, and whenever I caught a glimpse of a girl with dark hair, my heart would jump before realizing it wasn't her. Then, things took a darker turn. I read online articles referencing a girl with a similar description who had been found wandering in the woods, completely detached from reality, mumbling disjointed phrases about monsters and voices. My hands trembled as I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. Unable to cope, I spent hours scouring social media, looking through incomplete posts that hinted at her torment. Her twisted journey poured out like a torrent, revealing photographs taken by brave souls who had stumbled upon her outlines in the woods, and her pale skin stretched thin around sharp bones told stories of exposure and madness. I started having nightmares where I'd be in those woods, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed into the darkness, and no matter how often I tried to shake her off, claiming I didn't know her or pushing her away, her defiance held strong as she kept walking deeper into the shadows. The last time I looked at my reflection, I was no longer certain I recognized the person staring back. I felt her presence there, in the corners of my mind, her words echoing constantly, "You did this." I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape her. Months later, I got a text from an unknown number, just a photo of the woods at dusk, eerily peaceful yet filled with a foreboding vibe that seemed to throb through the screen. It was enough to send panic coursing through me, drowning out any rational thought as I looked outside, reluctant to find darkness closing in. I remember hearing the whispers of friends fading into the background, watching people laugh and smile while my heart raced in turmoil, and that night, those damn woods pulled me into them. I followed an inexplicable pull driving me deeper, each step echoing with the sounds of my heart, the shadows teasing my thoughts, knowing that at any moment Emily would appear, and she did. I felt her icy fingers grazing the back of my neck as I stood petrified, and then she whispered, quiet as the shadows, "You're next." I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, convinced it was a waking nightmare, yet a crippling dread filled me each day. School ended, graduation approached, but Emily's presence never left. Her haunting became my reality as I carried her shadow with me, the weight unbearable. Years later, I could only wonder if every girl I saw with dark hair was her lost soul begging for release or if I was just chasing phantoms of my own making. I made a girl quit school, and even if I could erase the past, I know the guilt would cling to me forever, a ghastly reminder that sometimes the woods don't take you, but they let you wander, trapped in a torment of your own design. In the heart of a city that pulsed with life, I found my solace in the lonely glow of dimly lit bars where judgment was drowned in whiskey and the air buzzed with secrets, and it was there, snugly tucked in a shadowy booth, that I made my vow. I hadn't tipped in the last 3 years, and I didn't give a fuck. The decision came not from malice but from a necessity to reclaim a sense of control over my disintegrating life, a ritualistic rebellion against the bitterness that seeped into my bones after I lost everything, my job, my home, even my fiancée, who walked away with that monologue about being a drain on her happiness. Each time I slid my glass back across the counter with the imprint of a bartender's hopeful eyes trailing after it, I couldn't shake the thrill of rebuffing the societal expectations that bound us all. However, it wasn't merely defiance, it became a haunting blend of freedom and guilt that lingered long after I staggered home, drunk on cheap cocktails and self-righteousness. And that's when the real nightmare began. One fateful night, I found myself at my usual bar, a cramped, in a charming way, dive called the Rusty Nail, where the neon lights flickered like dying stars and the music from the jukebox felt personal. It was here that I met her, a waitress named Claire, with striking blue eyes that reminded me of lost summer days, and a smile that somehow hinted at an understanding for my pain. She slipped a drink in front of me, a double whiskey, her signature move, her gaze lingering as she waited for my ritual dismissal, the lack of a tip. I could see the disappointment pool in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper, brushed aside too quickly. That night, she lingered longer, sharing snippets of her life, and I told her about my spirals, my failures, and our conversation danced around the topic of tips until I blurted it out, "I'm not tipping anyone ever again, and I feel liberated doing it." Claire raised an eyebrow yet held her tongue, and for a moment, I felt like she saw me not as a deadbeat, but as a fellow soul grappling with the wreckage of life. The connection was as electric as it was fragile, yet I clutched it tightly, virtually diluting my guilt down with every drink served, until that inexplicable bond between us deepened into something resembling companionship. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself returning to the Rusty Nail more frequently, almost obsessively. Claire remained my anchor, but I was careful to maintain emotional distance, reminding myself that tipping would mean betraying my resolve, conceding to a life that had already stripped me bare. One night, consumed by the haze of too many drinks, I watched as Claire dealt with a rough customer, a man drowning in liquor and anger who felt entitled to her body as well as her service. I could see the tension ripple in her shoulders as she deflected his advances with the grace of an acrobat, yet I was gripped by a wild mix of anger and an inexplicable protectiveness, my resolve faltering. When the man snatched a drink and carelessly tossed coins at her, a welling fury ignited within me, and I hurled my drink across the bar, splattering whiskey everywhere, something primal surging forth as I confronted the man. Our heated words drew the attention of others, and the bartender, always ready for trouble, stepped in. In the chaos that followed, I took a moment to look back at Claire and something in her eyes shifted. They were no longer warm, but instead filled with fear as the situation escalated into a jarring confrontation, the noise mingling with my guilt as I was ejected from the bar, the doors slamming behind me. The event spiraled in my mind like the relentless whirl of dark thoughts, and with each passing day without a tip, the weight of my conscience thickened like smoke, obscuring the flickering light of my connection with Claire. I began to see shadows curling in the corners of my mind, whispers growing louder, a voice that shifted from an echo of bitterness to something sinister, urging me to embrace my intentions fully. Once simple actions now felt predestined, as if the universe aligned to shun me, every day severing that tie with Claire which had, despite my obstinacy, buoyed me when I felt lowest. It was late one night when I found myself standing beneath the flickering neon light of the rusty nail, drawn like a moth to a flame, waiting for Claire's shift to end. I had concocted a plan, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm through an act of kindness. The truth whispered that it had been too long without tipping, and my heart raced at the thought of bringing her flowers. But when I finally entered, I saw a different scene unfolding before me. Claire was not behind the counter but sitting at a table with that same ugly customer, laughing, her blue eyes sparkling as if nothing had ever happened, and my heart sank. It twisted as anger wove through me, igniting the rage I thought I'd buried. My footsteps echoed as I approached, every step fueled by the denial of my hurt. My fists clenched as I confronted her, demanding to know why she would ever settle for such a creep. My words poured out so viciously, bitter accolades uttered with venom before my resolve shattered, leaving me stranded with a cocktail of betrayal and despair. She looked up with a mix of pity and disappointment, and for the first time, it felt real. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and just as I was about to speak, the ghost emerged from my past, the same man I had a confrontation with before, eyes wrestling with laughter and malice, as he turned to me with a smile as jarring as broken glass. "Thought you weren't tipping anymore, huh?" he crooned, the contempt dripping from his words like syrup, and I realized it wasn't just a bar anymore, it was a stage where I was being watched, where consequences no longer offered sanctuary. I stumbled backward, retreating into the cruel echo of my own words, feeling something inside crack as Claire stepped between us, her face burning with anger, and in that split second, the shadows finally closed in, weaving the silence into something more sinister, a reflection of all my failed choices painfully culminating in this moment. In the chaos, the gloaming filled with laughter turned hollow, the walls whispered secrets against my regret, and I realized the universe didn't just want to isolate me. No, it craved expansion, feeding hungrily on my denial, and as I turned to flee, the laughter escalated to a roar, mingling with a sense of impending doom that clawed at my chest, and it was then that the truth enveloped me. I hadn't just abandoned the act of tipping, I'd tipped too far into the darkness, fooling myself into believing I could carve a space where connection could thrive without the lingering weight of kindness. 3 years of shadows had dissected my humanity, and as I left that bar, I couldn't help but wonder whether I'd hail the return to that sense of liberation or succumb to the silence, my heart now tethered to an invisible thread that felt severed, forever lingering on the precipice between choice and consequence, battling the echoes of laughter that chased me into the night, knowing I was more lost than I ever truly wanted to admit.
I never thought a high school election could be the catalyst for so much chaos, but when I found myself losing the race for class president to Alex, a guy who was as popular as a sparkling social media influencer and twice as fake, something inside me snapped. Leading up to the election, I had poured my heart into my campaign, pouring countless hours into speeches and posters, all while trying to promote my vision of a more inclusive school, only to watch as Alex waltzed around, throwing lavish parties and posting perfectly staged selfies that made me feel like a ghost compared to his booming presence. On that fateful day, as the countdown to the announcement ticked down, I felt an undercurrent of dread snaking through my thoughts, an awareness that my passion for change stood no chance against shallow charm. When the principal finally declared Alex the winner, the sound of raucous applause and laughter felt like a dagger plunging into my chest, leaving me breathless with anger and humiliation. In a fit of rage, I stormed out of the auditorium, unable to contain my gnawing frustration, not just at losing but at the entire system that glorified mediocrity over genuine effort. I was tired of pretending it didn't matter. It did matter. Fueled by indignation, I hastily drafted a resignation letter on my phone, angrily posting it in our class group chat, bitterly declaring that there was no way someone like Alex could lead us. I thought my message might resonate, maybe even go viral around the school, but instead, it was met with a silence that felt heavier than the thundering applause I had just witnessed. The next day, however, my decision spiraled into something far more sinister. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but not of support. Instead, my peers turned on me, the whispers and snickers echoing down hallways like a haunting wind, leaving me isolated. I had unleashed something I couldn't contain. A dark curiosity started spreading. Who were these people I once called friends, who pretended loyalty while eagerly stoking the coals of someone else's success? I began to notice strange things around me, my locker mysteriously jammed with an array of sticky notes, taunting me with phrases like "just a loser" or "a standing ovation for Alex." Every morning before first period, there was something new, something that felt eerily tailored just for me, an intelligent push of humiliation that seemed to stalk my every step. That's when I saw the first video, a poorly lit, grainy clip of a group of students huddled together near the library, whispering and pointing at me, hatching conspiracies about my sour grapes and my unpopularity. It made my skin crawl. The realization that I was being hunted, and not for sport, but for fun, twisted their laughter into something monstrous. I tried talking to a teacher, but the weight of my accusations fell flat. They simply encouraged me to turn the other cheek and think positively. But how could I? Those whispers chose me as their entertainment. I knew I couldn't let this go. I began obsessively scrolling through social media, seeking recognition of my turmoil, wondering if others felt it too. I stumbled upon an obscure forum, a shadowy place where school dramas festered and spilled into the digital abyss, a chaotic collection of stories that made mine seem mundane. But buried in that cacophony was a community that thrived on misfortune, a hive intent on exposing what they deemed hidden truths. It was the perfect storm, and I couldn't look away. As weeks turned into months, I became a reluctant participant in this new narrative unfolding, a corner of cyberspace that amplified the vindictive laughter I felt daily. I learned that Alex wasn't just skating by on privilege, he had secrets of his own, and in that forum, I was pushed by an anonymous figure toward the darkest corners of gossip. I started posting about my experiences, disguised through an anonymous handle, weaving a narrative that cast me as the unyielding hero fighting against the corruption. I expected support, but received something unexpected, a raw, visceral acknowledgement of pain. Those who saw my plight echoed it back to me, but the moment I dared to mention Alex's shadowy connections, the laughter morphed into something darker, urging me to dig deeper. Days turned into a fever dream, losing track of what was real and what was a manufactured facade. So, when I finally decided to take action, concocting elaborate schemes to expose Alex, plotting to record him making lewd remarks hidden behind the bathrooms, my sense of moral clarity was long gone. I knew I had crossed a line, but it was intoxicating, like a drug feeding a mania that pulsated through every fiber of my being. Now, even in the dead of night, I would scroll through my phone, glued to what was once my biggest fear, the threat of being unknown, the scorn of being invisible, all black and white images blurring into the chaotic storm that consumed me. Then came the night that everything crashed. In the depths of a swirling digital web, Alex's world collided with mine, and secrets fell like raindrops during a storm. During a party, I confronted him, armed with evidence of his misdeeds, but ended up cornered, outnumbered by his smug entourage. I was desperate, crying out about everything that had been done to me, about the lies and the clenched fists of the school's social hierarchy, but no one cared. They laughed at my anguish, drowning me in a cascade of ridiculing comments and shoves. The weight of humiliation twisted inside me, morphing into something more sinister, until I felt myself reach a breaking point. I don't know what happened next. Maybe adrenaline took over, or something darker that had been festering inside erupted like a volcano, but in that moment, I snapped. I lunged at Alex, screaming. The throng around us scattered, shocked, but it didn't matter. I felt unstoppable as I threw him against a wall, the sound of his head connecting with the metal locker echoing through the hallway, a warning clap to the mocking audience. As the chaos unfolded around me, blurred by my own rage, I thought about how everything had gotten so out of hand, how a simple school election had turned me from hopeful visionary to deranged antagonist in my own story. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't hide any more from the truth that had chased me simply because I had chosen to be vulnerable. There, in that moment of exposed honesty, I didn't care if it cost me everything. I was done being the side character in someone else's narrative.
It was a meaningless night, just a threadbare Tuesday in a city that was all glaring lights and shallow smiles, the kind where loneliness could wrap around you tighter than a warm blanket, suffocating in its comfort, and I was drinking alone at a bar when it hit me. I'd been invisible for way too long. With every passing glance from strangers fading into the vinyl of the booth behind me, it felt like I'd become a mere phantom, hovering on the outskirts of their lives, and in a moment of reckless abandon, I muttered to myself that I might sleep with the first guy who says I'm pretty, a joke, a desperate plea, or maybe an ill-conceived promise to change my own narrative. The bartender shot me a sideways glance, amusement flickering in his eyes as he poured another drink, but then, out of the blue, a figure stepped into my periphery, someone who had the audacity to make my heart race in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying, an unkempt blonde with exaggerated confidence, his gaze settling on me like a moth seeking warmth from flame. He leaned against the bar, his grin cocky, yet something in his expression was unsettling, as if he could smell the darkness lurking beneath my skin, and just as I considered sliding down the bar to safety, he leaned closer and grinned wider, his voice smooth as silk. "You're pretty," he said, words draping over my senses like a warm blanket, igniting something in me that screamed to be set free. I barely felt the flush creeping into my cheeks, that desperate need for validation turning treacherous, and the world around us blurred into insignificance as all the barriers I'd built teetered on the brink of collapse, the odd familiarity of his gaze shattering that carefully constructed wall, and just like that, the playful dare I'd thrown into the dark now sat weighty and solemn in the air between us, charging the moment with an unforeseen kind of gravity, and before I could think better of it, before that voice in my head could guide me back toward reason, I found myself nodding, inching closer, my heart hammering in my chest like a war drum. The night spiraled into chaos, we slipped out into the neon-streaked streets, the city humming with a life that felt foreign after my self-imposed exile, and a flicker of worry flashed through my mind, but it was drowned out by the intoxicating thrill of it all, this strange chemistry overwhelming and bizarre, the risk dancing at the edge of every moment. I didn't know him, didn't even know his name, yet we laughed as we wandered past the bars and clubs, our banter laced with layers I barely understood, and just like that, we ended up in a dark corner of the alley behind a forgotten diner, the air thick with smoke and whispers of secrets, where his lips found mine with urgency, something desperate and primal igniting between us. I was lost in his kiss, tasting rebellion and freedom as his hands roamed my body, and as the moment stretched into eternity, I felt myself surrendering, the forgotten parts of myself awakening. Yet amidst the passion, a small voice in my head whispered a warning. There was something off, a frisson of danger curling around us like a wisp of fog, but I pushed it down, shoving it into the corners of my mind as he pulled me closer, almost possessively, and that's when I noticed the change, the way his eyes darkened, losing the spark of mischief, morphing into something predatory, and I felt a chill creep down my spine as panic threaded in, the world drifting out of focus just when clarity should have struck, and suddenly, as if the shadows themselves had fingers, he gripped my wrist tighter, a little too tight, and I could feel the pulse of my heart clawing its way up my throat as reality came rushing back. "Why won't you let me in?" he growled, something unspeakable lurking in the depths of that gleam in his eye, and I could suddenly see past his charm, the mask slipping to reveal a visage bruised by the darkness festering behind it. Laughter that had seemed so careless now felt hollow, like the night itself had conspired to deceive me, and just as the air thickened with uncertainty and fear, I stumbled back, breaking the spell, realizing that I had underestimated the weight of my words, the potential darkness lurking behind the simple acknowledgement of prettiness. My voice quivered as I tried to conjure an excuse, a path to safety, regret surging through me, trailing hot and furious as instincts kicked in, but he held me in place with that relentless grip, eyes boring into mine like he could see everything, the cracks and scars I'd tried to hide, his gaze pinning me down as if I were prey, and I was paralyzed, caged in that fleeting mistake, in the silent screams of my own mind begging me to break free. Shaking, I thought again of every moment I'd spent invisible, of every time I'd doubted myself, of how little I'd believed in my own worth until now, and that realization clashed with the panic washing over me, now a looming threat bleeding through my veins as I fought for breath, trying to maintain a fragile grip on my reality. Just as I was about to scream, the night itself ruptured, A couple stumbled into the alley, laughter spilling in laughter and chaos, and in that brief distraction, I broke away, surging past him back toward the pulsating base of the party. But the echo of his voice, chilling and insistent, haunted me even as the noise of life surrounded me with warmth, and somewhere in the swirling shadows of that night, I could still feel his gaze lingering, a promise of danger that now felt like an infestation, clawing at my skin, whispering that the lines between pretty and perilous had blurred in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. As I finally settled back into my seat, attempting to drown the panic with another drink, I couldn't help but think about the folly of that initial dare. I might have wanted to embrace every last thrill, every fleeting validation, but what I had brushed against tasted much more like a curse, a warning that maybe the city would swallow me whole, wrapped in a sleek glamour laced with doom. And as I stared into the glass filled with ice and alcohol, I understood something deeply unsettling. Sometimes the first words that slip between strangers can lead you straight into darkness, and the scars of those choices can cut deeper than you might ever know.
I've always been protective of my belongings, especially my expensive headphones. They were a gift from my grandfather before he passed, and they're not just headphones, they're a piece of my history, my sanctuary. Living in a small, cramped apartment with my roommate, Jenna, had its challenges, especially when it came to boundaries. Jenna was charming in her own right, a free spirit, a whirlwind of messy hair and bright laughter that could fill a room, but she also had a way of pushing my limits, always borrowing things without asking and then somehow convincing me it was totally okay. A few months ago, she borrowed my headphones for the first time, saying her own had broken, and though I had reservations, I couldn't say no when she gave me that pleading look. But when I noticed the small scratches on the ear pads upon their return, my stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. It felt like she was borrowing not just my headphones but part of my soul, and every damage was a betrayal. Weeks passed, and I resolved to keep the headphones locked up whenever I left the apartment, but last Friday, she approached me with her typical sunny smile, asking to borrow them just for a quick session. I hesitated, feeling that familiar unease wash over me. Please, just for a couple of hours. I promise I'll be super careful. But recalling the state they had returned in last time, I couldn't help but instinctively shake my head. The conversation escalated. She accused me of being selfish and paranoid, and while she ranted, I felt my heart race, my mind racing as I tried to explain the value of that gift, but my words fell upon deaf ears. It spiraled into a shouting match, and I was ready to slam the door against her face just to feel vindicated for standing my ground. But when night fell and I thought I would have the space to breathe, something felt off. As I lay in bed, the silence of the apartment grew oppressive, and a creeping sense of dread settled over me. The moment I heard the unmistakable click of the door opening, my heart stopped. I glanced at my phone, 2:13 a.m. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but the soft sound of something sliding against the hardwood floor got louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of my headphones being moved. I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Peeking around the corner into the dimly lit living room, I saw Jenna hunched over my desk, glancing back nervously, her fingers intertwined with the cords of my headphones, the terrible glint of defiance in her eyes. "I know you're up. It's just a pair of headphones," she hissed, her tone laced with an eerie calmness that sent chills down my spine. I could have chosen to scream, to lash out or call her out, but something deep within me made me instinctively choose a cold silence, watching eerily as she continued to act like a thief in the night. An unsettling rush washed over me. I knew then that this wasn't about the headphones, this was a battle of wills, and I had no intention of losing. "You think I'm just going to let you take them?" I finally managed to whisper, breaking our shared silence, my voice low enough to shake among the shadows. The moment stretched into an eternity as her eyes widened in surprise, but then, to my horror, a sinister smile crept across her face, as though she relished being challenged. "You need to lighten up, you really do," she said, her voice becoming mocking, each word dripping with disdain. "The world won't end if you just let go a little." I felt a fire spark in my chest, booting my fight or flight instincts into high gear, as I stepped out into the living room, the shadows closing in around me like a predator ready to pounce. "You're not taking them from me, Jenna," I said, now resolute. Her confusion morphed into anger, and in return, I felt an unnatural strength overcome me. It was almost like I was possessed by a vengeful spirit teaching me the gravity of self-defense. Just as she reached for the headphones, I lunged, gripping her wrist tightly as I felt the aura shift between us, transforming the air into ice. After a tense grapple, she finally shoved me away, stumbling back, and in that moment, something terrifying happened. The lights flickered, casting a creepy shadow against the walls, dancing as if mirroring our turmoil. "You don't understand what you're asking for," she whispered, her voice suddenly trembling. "You don't know what happens when you refuse someone something they want." The atmosphere became thick with unsung words. My pulse quickened, every rational thought screaming for me to vacate the situation, but I was locked in, eyes wide as Jenna approached me, menacingly, almost hypnotically. "You think this was just about the headphones? You're clueless, and now," she leaned closer until I could smell her panic and desperation, "now you're in the way." Before I could react, the faint blare of my headphones crackled to life, pulling me out of her chaotic hold. Colors swirled as if the universe had reset. I closed my eyes, feeling the world spin, a haunting whisper flooding my senses, "You should have let me borrow them." As the sound overtook me, I realized too late that I had not only lost my headphones but perhaps something far more precious, my peace of mind. I bolted from the apartment, not daring to look back, propelling me through the night air and into the unknown, knowing I could never step foot back in there again. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most harbor darkness just waiting for the slightest chance to uncover itself, and sometimes, in refusing something that feels insignificant, you find that you've awakened something truly terrifying lurking just beneath the surface. I never thought I would reach a point where I had to make a post like this, but here I am, desperate for validation on whether I'm the asshole in this twisted situation. It all started last spring when my brother, Mark, began showing up unannounced at my apartment. At first, I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd drop in with some lame excuse about needing to borrow a tool or ask for advice on his car, but as weeks passed, his visits morphed from casual to obsessive. It wasn't long before I noticed things started to feel off. He'd expertly manipulate the conversation to shift focus to my life, probing about my job, my friendships, my love life, as if gathering data to fuel some hidden agenda. I brushed it off as sibling curiosity at first, shrugging it away until that one fateful afternoon I came home from work to find my door wide open. Panic washed over me as I rushed inside, heart racing, to find my apartment completely intact. But there, in the living room, was a note rested on my coffee table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You need to be more open to me." It unnerved me more than I could express. Was I being paranoid? I decided to confront him, and when I did, Mark laughed it off, insisting I was reading too much into it. But I was no longer comfortable with him just popping by whenever he felt like it. I needed my space. So, after much deliberation, I made the decision to change the locks. When I told him, he looked at me, the laughter draining from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. He said nothing but walked away, a shadow crossing his features. A week later, I woke up in the dead of night to the distinct sound of my door jiggling. My heart pounded as I froze in fear, listening carefully, praying it was just an old pipe or a figment of my imagination. But no, the rattling persisted for what felt like hours, and then it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for the right moment to breach my sanctuary. I buried myself in my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. Mark was relentless. The next morning, I found more notes scattered around my apartment, all manner of things from "I just want to help" to "Why can't you see I'm your only family?" It was suffocating, the pervasive sense of dread that began to chase me through my days. I felt trapped in a nightmare, and the lines of love and manipulation blurred until there was nothing left but darkness. I decided to take action. I went to the police station and filed a report. They couldn't do much, just a recognized nuisance, they said. As I left, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to protect me. Every break in my routine, every sound outside my window incited pure terror. I looked for any chance to escape, weekend getaways, late-night shifts, anything to avoid the haunting presence of my brother. And then one stormy evening, with thunder rumbling and rain pouring like the sky itself was breaking apart, someone banged on my window. It was Mark, drenched and grinning in a way that set off alarm bells in my mind. "Surprise. I thought I'd come over to help you with that article you're working on." The sickening jolt of dread coursed through my veins. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I quickly mumbled something and darted to the door, locking it just as he reached for the handle. But I could see him through the peephole, my own brother. His grin widened, but his eyes were wild, icicles of twisted madness in the torrential downpour. With every thump of his fist against the door, the world outside blurred, leaving only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I was losing my grip, feeling as if I was slipping into some alternate reality. Was I the villain for wanting space? Was it wrong to feel caged by someone who claimed to love me, or was I just pushing him away? I yelled at him to leave, realizing too late the trap I had walked into, his soft chuckle echoing unnervingly through the night. But I'm your family. We're supposed to be close. I finally lost it, my voice cracking as I screamed, aren't you supposed to care about what I want? And just like that, the laughter stopped. Mark's expression shifted, his mouth tightened as he said, you think you can change the locks on family? You can't escape me. I bolted to my bedroom, fumbling for my phone, but as I turned, I saw him standing in my living room, having somehow slipped through a window I thought I had locked. My breath caught in my throat as he said very calmly, it's not just the lock settling the score, sis. You need to learn that family always finds a way in. Then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, I was sprawled on the floor of my apartment with no memory of what happened next, but one thing was clear, in that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in a family tied tighter than the strongest chain, each link weighed down with the burden of madness. My brother was no longer just a sibling, he had become something beyond that, something dangerous, twisted. Now, as I sit here, typing this, I can't help but wonder if I did the right thing by confronting him, changing the locks, and asking him to stay away, but the truth is, I still hear his laughter echoing through the walls, and that little voice keeps haunting me. AITA for telling my brother to stop coming unannounced? I think I might be the biggest fool for thinking I could change the locks on the chains binding us. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, we can do it next week. Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me. Anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, he wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him. With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. I just wanted him to have fun, he muttered, eyes cast downward. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. What's going on? Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pang of desperation as I fought to find the right words. Mark, you're losing us. The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference.
It was a blistering summer day when my friends convinced me to join them at the river for what they described as the quintessential teenage adventure, inner tubing down the winding, sun-kissed waters. My parents were out of town, and I figured, what the hell, right? Besides, trust my friends, especially Derek and Carla, they promised it was going to be epic. So, I threw on my swimsuit, packed a cooler full of sodas, and headed out, laughing and joking as we piled into Derek's car like a bunch of thrill-seeking idiots. The river was picturesque, shimmering sun, lush trees bending over the edges, the water flowing with that gentle, inviting burble that screamed fun. We inflated our tubes right on the shore, children of the wild, ready to conquer the river like a ragtag army. The first hour was pure bliss, floating down, shouting, splashing water on each other, and reminiscing about childhood memories. We drifted lazily, sunburns starting to peek at our exposed skin, until I felt it, the unmistakable pressure in my stomach that could only mean one thing. I should have known better. I had eaten way too many snacks back at Derek's house, but now I was out here, miles down the river with no restroom in sight, feeling the impending doom of the worst kind of discomfort. I casually drifted a bit behind, trying to make light of it with humor, but my laughter was swallowed by the sound of rushing water and what felt like impending disaster. I considered my options, paddle to the shore and hope to find a bathroom, or just ride it out. Deep down, I knew it'd be a bad idea. Yet, with every passing moment, the pressure mounted, and I was painfully aware of the stares my friends were throwing at me, their laughter ringing hollow against my anxious mind. Just then, the river plunged into a small rapids, and as I gasped and whooped with adrenaline, the pressure in my gut screamed, and I knew I had to make a decision. Wisdom would have said to let it be, that no one would ever find out. But with one last surge of courage, and maybe a tad bit of madness, I naively thought I could manage both the thrill of the rapids and the growing urgency twisting my insides. It couldn't be that bad, right? As we slipped over the edge of the rapids, my fear clouded my judgment, and I lost the battle. The second I hit the calm part of the river again, I felt it release, more of an explosion than a trickle, and in that instant, I realized I'd just done the absolute unthinkable. I felt wretched, frozen in time, caught between sinking into the abyss of humiliation and acceptance. The water didn't care, just another way to taint the purity of its flow. Oh God, I looked around, panicked, and all I could see were my friends blissfully floating away, seemingly unaware of my internal meltdown. Carla caught my eye. A playful grin painted across her sun-kissed face, and I felt a chill run through me. I knew she would eventually smell it. My heart raced faster than I could paddle, trying to make myself look unbothered, but it's impossible to carry such a secret in the open air, when every breeze seems to whisper shame. A minute felt like an eternity as I prayed for the winds to shift and my friends to forget I was alive, and for a fleeting moment, they were blissfully unaware, their voices filled with laughter, until Derek suddenly paused, his nose wrinkling, and just like that, the laughter faded into an uneasy silence. "Oh, what the hell is that?" he shouted, looking at me with a mix of confusion and disgust. I watched as his expression morphed into dread. He knew. Carla turned her head, her grin melting into horror, and I felt the eyes of the world pin me to that moment forever like a haunting flashcard. The laughter disintegrated, replaced by gasps of understood betrayal. They had my number, and God help me, I was trapped. The water wrapped around me like a noose, suffocating, as horror spread among us like a contagious plague. I wanted a black hole to swallow me up, to cease to exist where I was ensnared in the stifling silence, no one wanting to breach the profound act of what had just transpired. Derek made a gagging sound and tried to steer his tube away from me, suddenly laughing, but it was hollow and bitter. I could hear it choke against his throat. "Dude, are you serious?" Carla's voice was piercing and laced with disbelief. Their laughter turned sharp, accusatory, like arrows aiming straight for my heart, every single word a reminder of my fall from grace. "You can't be serious," Derek repeated like a mantra through laughter mixed with horror, yet the moment felt too heavy to bear. I felt the world shifting beneath me, friendships teetering on the edge of collapse, while I, the warrior of shame, faced the consequences of lax judgment and urgency. The river felt like an executioner's platform, my laughter a distant memory, lost in the strum of nature's cruel symphony. The rest of the ride home was a tumult of emotions. They mocked me gently at first, but the laughter quickly turned into vicious teasing. I could no longer keep my head held high. Instead, I wanted to sink as low as possible under the waters of the current. Every splash they made felt like a calculated attack on what's left of my dignity, and I swore that day they were nothing but sharks, circling my pathetic, exposed soul. By the time we reached the shore, the laughter had dulled to mere echoes of what had happened, haunting for years on, as the memory carved itself ever so deeply into my existence. I'd hoped it would fade, that maybe, just maybe, it would become just another funny story to tell, an absurdity shared later in life. But I learned quickly that some traumas are too profound, too intimate, meant to be buried deep beneath the surface as I became the punchline in our circle, a shadow of mockery. To this day, the smell of chlorine and river water pulls me back to that fateful afternoon, the laughter of my so-called friends, and the way I unceremoniously mutilated my youth with a choice that would follow me forever. I stride through life now with a weight that can't be shed, a darkness rooted in those ephemeral moments of childish recklessness, and as I sit here and type this, my heart races, wondering if the guilt of that day will ever truly wash away. When I'm at work, sometimes I let people have things for free, and I never thought it would lead to something terrifying until the day Ellen walked in. She was just another customer in my small-town convenience store, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's names and the daily special is written in fading marker on a chalkboard. Ellen always looked a little out of place, her clothes were too nice for our rundown neighborhood, her hair was perfectly done, and her smile felt rehearsed. At first, I thought she was just trying to lighten her workload by picking up snacks for the craft night she hosted at her house. But on this particular Thursday, something about her seemed different, as though she was searching for something deeper than just a snack. I had just finished restocking when she came up to the register with a pack of gum, her eyes flickering to the scant selection of drinks behind me. There was something compelling about her, something that made me want to reach out and connect, to break the mundane cycle of transactions that droned on day after day. Without thinking, I told her, "You can have that for free." Her smile widened, revealing cheerful dimples that brought warmth to the usual chill of the store. But instead of gratitude, I felt a shiver slip down my spine when she leaned closer and whispered, "You should be careful what you give away." Those words lingered like a bad omen, clinging to my thoughts even as she walked out the door, a lightweight breeze shifting the air behind her. The following week, I found myself drawn to her again as she entered the store, this time with a careful look on her face. I knew she was examining me as much as I was her, and maybe I was the only one who noticed how she hovered at the edge of the fluorescent lights, as if standing too close to them. I offered her a candy bar, thinking it might put the doubt to rest, but instead, her expression turned cold. She took it, all while meticulously counting how many candies I'd given away in the last month. The darkness wrapped around the air in the store like a fog, thick and heavy, and I started to notice more signs of it, the late-night customers leaving awkward silences in their wake, customers who glanced over their shoulders as if expecting a shadow to follow them. My co-workers thought I was losing it, talking about paranoia and stress, but each time Ellen came in, those whispers echoed louder. One evening, I had to stack supplies along the back of the store when I stumbled across an old flyer pinned to the wall for a missing person, a girl who had vanished without a trace. I felt a weird flutter in my stomach, a connection that maybe I was overlooking. The flyer faded and blurred, but the mundane words turned sinister. If you have any information, please come forward. I found out she had last been seen at a craft night, the same one Ellen hosted. I didn't get a chance to ask her about it. When she came in next, I noticed the unsettling shadow beneath her eyes. I tried to confront her with the flyer, but she laughed, her voice lacking sincerity, and then, unnervingly, I felt an overwhelming urge to offer her more free things, as if my instincts were being warped like the circumstances surrounding her presence. I should have listened to myself. I heard an urgency in her laughter that echoed around me like an alarm. Instead, I fell deeper into the rabbit hole, offering her the chocolates, the drinks, and even snacks, feeling compelled, even enchanted, to keep giving her whatever she wanted. And that's when everything spiraled. The last time she came in, she stood at the counter, her eyes fixated on me in a way that made my skin crawl. You know, those who take things for free shouldn't be surprised when they lose more than they bargained for, she muttered, her voice taking on a melodic yet ominous tone that resonated within me. I could hardly breathe, yet I felt unable to move as she leaned in closer, the fluorescent lights flickering uncertainly above us. There was something watching from the shadows, something both inviting and menacing. In a fevered rush, I tried to shake off the discomfort. I offered her the last of my stash, the store's best energy drinks. You don't have to do that, she said, her smile twisting into something sinister yet sweet. Her fingers trailed over the drinks like an artist evaluating their work. But you'll come to find out that nothing in this world is free, not even the kindness of strangers. I think I was still in that trance when I waved her out the door, but the dim light of the store flickered violently at that moment, and I heard a faint whisper echo in the darkness, "Keep giving them away." I dropped the energy drinks, they shattered on the floor like glass hearts, and Ellen simply walked away, leaving me surrounded by the crumbled remnants of her malevolence. Days passed, each more distorted than the last, until I finally decided to close the store for good. There was a gnawing realization that every free thing I had given her had drained a piece of my soul, twisting me into something dark. Yet, every night I still found myself waking with a jolt, staring at my pale hands, thinking about the next customer who would walk through those doors, someone else I could offer something to, freedom or fate. As Ellen taught me, the lines blurred in a cruel game. I haven't seen her since the day I closed the store, but sometimes, when the night goes quiet, I hear whispers in the shadows, echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind, reminding me that when you give something up so easily, sometimes there's reflection in the darkness. And one day, perhaps I will pay that price.
It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, and after hours of cramped leg space and the constant hum of the engines, I was relieved to finally feel the plane start its descent. As we touched down, the anticipation of reuniting with friends for a long-awaited trip filled me with excitement, but that joy quickly dimmed when the plane rolled to a stop and the chaotic symphony of kids crying and parents shushing them erupted around me. Just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, a mother in the row ahead of me started shouting at her child, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, who had transformed himself into a living tornado of rage and defiance. He was poised to unleash a tantrum that could rival any natural disaster, kicking the seat in front of him with relentless fury, and then it happened. The mother, rather than reassuring him, began to scream, and her voice pierced through the dull noise of the cabin like a siren, as if the whole plane had become a stage for their performance. When the seatbelt sign turned off and the doors opened, I stood up eagerly, ready to move forward, when this little monster darted into the aisle, throwing his arms up and screaming as if he believed he could bring down the whole aircraft with just his cries. Corners of people's faces contorted with annoyance as frazzled parents tried to reason with the child while he stomped his feet, flailing like a banshee. In my peripheral vision, I noticed an older man behind me. He looked ready to snap, his patience already worn thin by the chaotic scene unfolding before us. As he shouted at the kid to stop acting like that and to get out of the way, I felt an unfamiliar pull of anger rise within me, an unyielding impulse ignited by worn-out anxieties of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was standing there, frozen in indecision, 1,000 possibilities passing through my mind. Should I step aside? Should I yell too? But then an audacious thought crossed my mind: why should I? It wasn't my child throwing a fit, and why was the rest of the world suffering under this child's tantrum? As the tantrum escalated, I stood my ground stubbornly. The boy began crying harder, his wails echoing through the cabin as he kicked his little feet against the aisles, making it impossible for anyone to get past. I watched as parents attempted to calm him down, but their efforts were futile. The little boy's pleading screams devolved into a cacophony of noise that seemed to seep into my very bones. I finally whispered, "You've got to be kidding me," under my breath, just as the elderly man behind me shoved my shoulder gently, signaling me to move aside, but instead, I clenched my teeth and grit my teeth, unwilling to give an inch. "Move," he exclaimed, hitching his backpack and glaring at the kid as if he could force him to cooperate through sheer will. It was surreal watching two adults struggle against the manic outbursts of a child, and in a fit of anger, I turned around and snapped at the man to back off, that this had nothing to do with me, and I wouldn't be the one to budge. My voice was louder than I intended, and a wave rippled through the crowd like I had unleashed some invisible force that suddenly everyone had felt. It silenced the room momentarily, and the little boy looked at me wide-eyed, screen-printed with confusion. The mother, no longer raising her voice, stood still with a glazed expression, her hands frozen on either side of her son, the heat of shame and frustration radiating off her. I was taken aback, realizing I was now at the center of this whirlwind, a moment where rage intertwined with guilt as my heart raced in my chest. I felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and regret, unsure if I had escalated the situation or somehow brought relief. I had thought I was being resolute, but instead, I found myself entangled in an emotional disaster. The tension in the cabin thickened, and as the seconds stretched into forever, the boy finally broke. He let out one last defiant scream and surprisingly spun around, sprinting back to his seat, still crying as loud as his lungs could manage, while parents finally scooped their children up and started to clear the aisle, moving around me like I was an immovable object in a world of chaos. But then something terrifying happened. As he settled back into his seat, I suddenly felt a rush of nausea sweep over me, an all too familiar feeling that accompanied moments of pure dread, a thought creeping into my mind that mirrored the chaos. I hadn't just deemed that child a nuisance, had I? I was now a villain in this story, solidified in place and surrounded by sympathetic glares from onlookers who had witnessed my outburst. Words flared hot at the tip of my tongue as I turned to the older man, a stranger who I now saw as a comrade in this blender of emotions. "I'm sorry," I stammered, a futile attempt to mend the invisible rift that had formed, but he laughed, a low, gravely laugh, and nodded, almost approvingly. "You didn't deserve that. No one did. You're not their babysitter," he replied, causing me to feel both relieved and more lost than ever. It dawned on me in that moment, this whole shambolic episode of human suffering was not only about the child, it was about me as well, but the more I dissected it in my head, the more I knew my reaction was rooted in my own tumultuous past. What I thought was just an inane airplane encounter was turning into a dissection of my own character weaknesses. I had endured far worse moments long before needing an emotional outlet against the harrowing memories that had seeped into my mind over time, of feeling trapped, of feeling like I couldn't escape my own emotional dysfunction that had caused echoes of laughter and anger to crumble into one another through time. It wasn't just about parenting, it was about trauma. This innocent child had opened a can that I wasn't ready to confront, and suddenly a flash of clarity struck me like lightning. What if I needed to be shaken for a reason? Luckily, as the line began to move, I found myself taking my first tentative step toward the exit, lingering behind the furious mother and her misbehaving child, drifting just far enough back to feel safe yet still close enough to engage in the raw humanity of what had unfolded. I made it to the door just behind them, and when we finally stepped into the cool air of the terminal, I caught a glimpse of the boy, still ensnared in his mother's frustrated grip. Their dynamic struck me as bittersweet, two broken souls meeting at an intersection of despair. At the last moment, I realized that the world isn't simply black and white. Every outburst is a story, every tantrum wrapped in layers of the unexplained, and in that instant, I forgave us all, even myself, for simply being human. With every part of me still unsettled, I merged back into the flow of travelers, carrying the weight of that awkward confrontation, caught in a web of empathy that lingered in the air, a breath away from devastation and understanding. And as I walked through the throng of people, I hesitated for just a moment to turn back, half expecting to catch the boy's eye, but instead, I found only the fleeting silhouettes of silhouettes blending into the crowd of hurried passengers, their lives intersecting through the storm, never to meet again.
I didn't mean for it to happen. When I moved to that sleepy little town just before sophomore year, I was still the kid who would lift up my shirt and make fart noises in the middle of class, trying to get a laugh from anyone who'd listen. But something about the way the kids in this new school looked at me made me want to be different, more cool, more laid back. That's when I met Lena. She was everything I wasn't: smart, sharp-witted, and the kind of beauty that turned heads without trying. We became friends instantly, bonding over our mutual love for the same offbeat music and those awful movies that only made sense late at night. I remember the first time we skipped class to go to the nearby park. We sat under the rusty swing set, her laughter vibrating through the balmy air, and I felt invincible. But slowly, things began to change. An old rumor surfaced, one I thought had died years ago, the one about my family being cursed. My dad had always scoffed at the idea, but when strange things started happening, I couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. It started small, a flickering light or an errant shadow that seemed to linger a moment too long. One afternoon, while we were studying in her room, I caught Lena gazing out her window, her bright green eyes glazed, as if she was staring into a different world. I teased her about daydreaming, but the light in her eyes dimmed. A week later, she arrived at school wearing these oversized glasses, joking she received them for being in the same room as me, classic Lena humor. Yet, something inside told me it was more than a mere joke. Her grades began slipping, her radiant laughter turning to whispers, her gaze often distant as if she were struggling to see, or even understand, what was happening around her. I brushed it off at first, but the further we delved into our friendship, the darker things became. One evening, I invited her over for a movie marathon, determined to cheer her up. As we settled in, the flickering of the old projector cast eerie shadows across her face, and as the horror film unfolded, I noticed a change. Every jump scare sent her flinching, but this time it was more than typical fear, it was palpable dread, like she was seeing something I couldn't. "What is it?" I asked, trying to pull her from whatever fog she was in. She shook her head, suddenly a quiet shell of the vibrant girl I once knew. With dread curling around my heart, I began to question if the curse was real, or if it had manifested through me, like a dark cloud hovering over us. It took weeks of avoidance before she finally confided in me that she'd been experiencing these alarming visions. It was bizarre, fragments of darkness creeping into her life, superimposing her reality with something sinister. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination or something more sinister, but she felt like she was losing herself. "I don't think it's just me anymore," she whispered, and I instinctively felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, too terrified to jump but unable to back away. I promised her we would get through this, her visions, her struggles, together. So we consulted this local librarian who dabbled in strange truths, exposing ourselves to whispered secrets underneath her breath, rituals, ancient curses, and something about an offering that could sever ties to darkness. I was skeptical but desperate to help. The more I tried to jam my head into these old pages, the more I felt immersed in Lena's pain. Hers became mine, and it seeped into my veins. We embarked on a project to break whatever held her captive, conducting half-baked rituals in the woods at night, convinced that we'd find answers in this fervent pursuit of cleansing her spirit. Each time we did, I noticed changes within myself, visions of my own, shadows that whispered and beckoned me closer to the abyss. It was as if I were trading pieces of my soul for hers, and with every encounter, I could see the toll it took on Lena. She wore her glasses like a shield, but the distance in her eyes grew sharper, like the world around her was warping just out of reach. One night after an especially restless ritual, we both stumbled home through a fog that felt like a living thing. That's when I noticed a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Lena froze, her breath hitching as our eyes met, yet it was as if she was somehow unable to see it. "Lena! Run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her into motion, but the shadows clawed at us, blurring my vision. This was it, the breaking point. She squeezed my hand like a vice, urging me to stop as I slammed through the door of her home. The moment we stepped inside, we both collapsed, panting, our minds racing. But Lena's glasses slipped from her face, shattering into pieces, framing her beautiful features in fractures of glass, and I swear something shifted in the room. It was as if the shadows inside her were set loose, pouring from her like a black cloud, and I felt my heart drop as I watched her transformation, a girl flickering between realms, trapped between reality and the void. The next day, she wore new glasses. They were bigger, more pronounced, as if she were attempting to see into a world I could no longer touch. We lost touch entirely after that. I found myself haunted by the curse that was never mine to begin with, paralyzed by the guilt of watching her spiral as if I had written the script, each laugh now a reprimand whispered in my ear. As months turned into years, I'd hear snippets of her story, how she was forced into a world of corrective lenses, unable to escape the shadow she once outran. I often wondered if she would forgive me, The kid too consumed by his own ego to see the damage unfolding in front of him. Maybe the real curse was love that turned into something monstrous, or perhaps it was simply the weight of knowing that I changed her life forever in a way that would echo relentlessly in the chambers of my memory. I still visit that park sometimes, wondering about the girl who wore oversized glasses, who now sees more than she should. The truth is, I caused a girl to have to get glasses for the rest of her life, but in reality, it's a much darker curse, and I fear one day, I might have to pay the price for it.
It was meant to be a simple first hangout, just me and Jenna, who I'd been crushing on since the moment I saw her in that crowded cafe, her laughter spilling like sunlight over the murky coffee, so when she invited me to a hike in the woods, I didn't think twice. I picked her up, my heart racing as I wondered if she'd notice my overenthusiastic cologne masking the scent of my nerves. The trail was gorgeous, dappled with autumn leaves, the air crisp and cool, and her presence felt electric, sending jolts of warmth through me even as the temperature dropped. As we trekked deeper into the woods, I found myself lost in conversation, trading stories about our childhoods and awkward high school moments, every laugh pulling us closer, every shared secret feeling like a pact. But as we reached a clearing glinting with sunlight, Jenna shivered slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She glanced at my oversized sweater, and with a playful grin, she asked if she could borrow it, clearly not ready for the chill settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. My instinct was to shrug it off and give it to her, but something about her request sent an icy tingle down my spine. Maybe it was that acute awareness of how easily one moment could shift into an entirely different reality. I hesitated, looking into her eyes, which flickered with both surprise and disappointment at my pause, and I finally said, "I think I'd rather not." It's, my favorite, which was a total lie, but I didn't know why I felt the need to withhold it. The flinch that crossed her face was subtle yet profound, but she quickly brushed it off, and we resumed our hike, the laughter now tinged with a hint of unease that I couldn't shake. The sun was almost gone, splattering the sky in streaks of orange and purple that felt surreal against the looming shadows that began to swallow the path we hadn't even realized we had ventured off. As we walked, the air turned heavy, and I noticed the woods felt different, as if everything was holding its breath, and I half wondered if the forest itself had come alive, watching our every step. We stumbled upon an old cabin, partially obscured by gnarled trees, its windows like empty eyes staring into the wilderness, and Jenna seemed drawn to it, almost against her will. I felt the instinct to grab her arm when she stepped towards the door, but it felt absurd. I wasn't her protector, just the guy who refused to give her my sweater. As if sensing my hesitation, Jenna turned to me, her expression eerily blank for someone who had just been speaking so animatedly. "Let's go check it out," she said with a tone that felt oddly detached, and despite every warning bell clanging in my mind, I followed her inside, the door creaking as if lamenting the intrusion. Inside, the air hung thick and musty, with wooden beams that groaned under the weight of years forgotten. Shadows cast by our flashlights flickered across the walls, revealing remnants of a life abandoned, a broken chair, dust-coated dishes piled in the corner. But one thing struck me as we explored: it felt wrong, almost like we had stepped into a scene that was not ours to witness. Jenna laughed suddenly, her voice echoing oddly in the silence, but when I turned to her, I saw that the darkness had drawn something out of her, her eyes dancing with a strange light that pulled at my gut. "I feel so liberated, don't you? Like we're breaking the rules," she said, her smile wide but unsettling, as if she was channeling some hidden energy swirling in the air. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away slowly, sensing something sinister lurking behind that innocent facade, but she caught me by the wrist, her grip firm yet fragile, a mix of desperation and allure. I wanted to pull away, to leave, but the intensity of her gaze held me in place, paralyzing with both fear and fascination. "Stay with me, just a bit longer," she whispered, and that was when I noticed shadows, long, curling shapes that seemed altogether too alive, creeping toward us from the corners of the cabin. Panic surged through me, the overpowering urge to flee clashing violently with my desire to keep Jenna close, but as I pried her fingers away and turned to run, a whisper echoed through the timbers, silky and suggestive yet dripping with malice: "You shouldn't have denied her the comfort of your warmth." I scrambled toward the door, my heart racing, but the shadows twisted and writhed, blocking my escape as Jenna's voice shifted, tinged now with desolation. "You'll regret this," she murmured, and beneath that familiar exterior, I caught a flicker of something else, something ancient and wrong that sent a chill ripping through my spine. As I finally shoved past the barrier of darkness and burst into the night, the weight of my decision crushed me. Was it worth it, not letting her borrow my sweater? The forest around me pulsed with an urgent energy as the last vestiges of light faded into the obsidian sky, and I sprinted back toward my car, glancing over my shoulder just once to see Jenna standing in the doorway of the cabin, her figure swallowed by shadows, but for a brief moment, she appeared almost ethereal, a desire woven into every sinew of her being. My heart clenched as I fumbled with my keys, entering the vehicle and slamming the door behind me, the haunting whispers still carving their way into my skull. I drove home in a daze, that night swirling in my mind as I grappled with what transpired, chills cascading down my body despite the warmth of my heater, wondering if I had just barely escaped something that could have consumed me whole. Now, days later, I replay the moment, obsession gnawing at my sanity, never quite shaken from the haunting image of Jenna, curiously beautiful yet impossibly insidious, but every time I try to shake off the fear, I hear her voice in my dreams, softly echoing, "You should have just let me wear your sweater." I never thought a simple question could unravel everything, but there I was, standing in the break room of my office, the scent of stale coffee and artificial lemon air freshener filling my lungs, when I turned to the pregnant woman beside me, Lisa, bright-eyed and vibrant even at 8 months along, and asked if she had decided whether she was having a boy or a girl. The moment the words left my lips, I felt an icy chill grip the air. Lisa's smile faltered, her eyes darting to the corner of the room as if she were searching for an escape, and I sensed something was off. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe she was just tired, but it was the awkward silence that followed that began to gnaw at my insides. Later that day, I heard whispers between coworkers, hushed tones discussing how Lisa had been acting strangely ever since I asked my innocent question, and for the first time, I wondered if I had crossed some invisible line. It was then that Jake, who sat 2 desks down, casually mentioned that Lisa had always been a bit superstitious about her pregnancy. She refused to know the gender or even discuss it, holding on to some kind of family belief that speaking it out loud would change the fate of the unborn child. I laughed off the comment, dismissing it as one of the workplace jokes he often liked to offer, but a seed of doubt was planted, and curiosity twisted my gut. A week passed, and Lisa's behavior became more and more erratic. One day she seemed fine, the next she was withdrawn, and rumors of her frequent trips to the restroom made their rounds, a silent testimony to the stress bubbling beneath the surface. I started to feel like I was the unwitting villain in a drama that I had no intention of starring in. On a particularly charged day, I decided it was time to confront the issue, a kind of reconciliation, perhaps. I approached her in that same break room, where we had shared laughs over coffee before her pregnancy became the only topic that seemed to matter. "Hey, Lisa," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "I didn't mean to upset you. I genuinely just wanted to know your baby's gender." She turned to me, her expression unreadable, and grounded her coffee cup in her hands so tightly I thought she might crush it. "You really don't understand, do you?" Her voice was low, almost trembling, and the weight of her gaze bore into me with all the intensity of an unexplainable fear. I shrugged, my stomach twisting again, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, "It's not about the baby, it's about the curse." A chill swept through me. "Curse?" I asked, half laughing, playing it off as more of a nervous impulse. But Lisa was dead serious. She spoke of her family's tradition, a long-standing belief that asking about the baby's gender would unleash an ancient entity, something she referred to as the unknowing, that thrived on secrets and manipulated destinies, insisting that it was not a mere fable but something that had affected her family for generations. Every woman before her who revealed the gender of their child had met with tragic outcomes, she warned, their lives spiraling into chaos soon after. I scoffed, trying to inject humor because that's what I did to mask my discomfort, but Lisa's eyes were wide, pleading. The color drained from my face as her story unraveled, tales of eerie coincidences and tragedies that befell those who broke the silence. I left the break room feeling a heaviness in my chest, questioning everything I thought was merely casual workplace banter. That evening, unable to shake her words, I went home to do research, swept up in stories of expectant mothers and inexplicable fates. Each story was darker than the last, and I couldn't help but feel a pressure building inside my mind, as if the very act of having asked about her baby had cracked open a door to something sinister. That night, I dreamt of Lisa's face, distorted with fear as shadows writhed in corners, whispering unspeakable secrets. The next day, I approached her again, nervously spewing apologies and assurances that I wouldn't mention it again, but when she looked at me, the fire had dimmed. She was a shell of the vibrant woman I had first known. "It's too late," she said softly, and my heart missed a beat. "You can't take it back now." My stomach dropped. I wanted to ask what she meant, but a part of me feared unraveling that thread even further. Over the following days, I watched her grow more and more withdrawn. Unbeknownst to her, I felt an inexplicable connection to her turmoil, as if I had unintentionally entered a contract, a sinister arrangement without any form of consent. Each day, a cloud of dread loomed in the office. Serial events of misfortune began to plague not just Lisa, but our entire workplace: minor accidents, inexplicable illnesses, disruptions during meetings that seemed part of a stretch of macabre coincidences. Jake suffered an unfortunate slip on a spilled drink, sending an entire tray of coffee crashing onto the floor, while another colleague got into a freak accident involving a printer explosion that sent him to the ER. I began receiving ominous texts from an unknown number that taunted, "What have you done?" The message sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the tension rising, thick enough to choke on, and I blamed myself for unleashing whatever malevolent force was at play. I could hardly concentrate, my mind racing to the moment I had uttered that question. It had turned into a nightmare loop festering in my brain, spiraling further until I reached the precipice of insanity. Louise, once a vibrant presence in our office, was nowhere to be found. Her desk remained untouched, an eerie ghost of her former self. In a moment of desperation, I reached out to her, sending texts and emails, each correspondences laden with apology, shame, and fear, but never got a response. Then one late evening, as I was the last person in the office, working late to avoid the silence of my own home, I heard a commotion from the break room, whispers wove in and out, almost caressing my ears, mixed with the sound of a soft cry. My heart raced, curiosity battled against dread, and against my better judgment, I crept towards the sound. Peering through the doorway, I froze. The lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that danced chaotically on the wall, and there stood Lisa, her features twisted in anguish, bathed in the eerie glow of fluorescent lights, a group of shadows encircling her, their faces shrouded in darkness. It was as if she were embroiled in some arcane ritual, and in that surreal moment, I felt both an overwhelming desire to run and an inexplicable urge to step forward to save her from whatever nightmare was unfolding. But the moment I took a step forward, they turned toward me, and the breath caught in my throat as every face transformed into a grotesque visage of laughter and grief, mouths forming words that spilled poison into the air. "You meddled, you asked, and now it's too late." I staggered back, horror seeping into my veins as the dim light faded, plunging the room into darkness, swallowing screams, swallowing everything whole, until I found myself running for the door, bursting out into the night, the cries echoing behind me. Days have passed, and yet the question still haunts me. Was I AITA for asking my pregnant colleague if she was having a boy or a girl? I didn't want to believe the stories, to think there was any truth in her fears, but something in me knows the shadows linger, that the unknowing watches. Lisa is gone, and the office is forever changed, shadows creeping across every desk, every hallway, and I cannot shake the sense that in asking that insipid question, I unleashed something meant to remain buried. Now every night, as the weight of silence envelops my home, I hear the whispers echoing outside my window, taunting me, and I know it was my curiosity that opened the door, and perhaps it was my life they were waiting to claim next. When I first moved into my tiny 2-bedroom apartment with Clara, I was excited to finally have a place of my own, an escape from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home. Clara was friendly and welcoming, and we bonded over our shared love of late-night baking marathons and binge-watching true crime documentaries. Everything was great until one evening, when I got home late after a long shift at the diner and decided to whip up a batch of cookies to unwind. The smell of chocolate chip dough rising in the oven felt like home, familiar and comforting, but just as I pulled the tray out, Clara's voice cut through the sweetness of the moment. "Can we talk?" she asked, her expression serious, which struck me as odd. I set the warm cookies on the cooling rack and sat down at the small kitchen table, eager to hear what was bothering her. Clara lowered her voice, as if someone might overhear us, and said, "I need you to promise me you won't use the oven again." My heart dropped, the request clawed at my mind, a bone-chilling whisper of unreasonableness. "What? Why?" I asked, incredulous. You just can't," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Every fiber of my being wanted to dismiss her, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Is this about your weird family back home?" I pressed, remembering the odd traits she'd shared, like her great-grandfather's obsession with farming the land even after moving to the city. Clara's gaze suddenly turned distant, like a clock unwinding. It's for your own good, she said quietly, and that's when I noticed how her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white against the faded oak of the table. I tried to reason with her, tell her that in all my previous apartments, I'd always used the oven, it was essential, the heart of my culinary dreams. But Clara remained firm, almost fearful. So, night after night, I reluctantly complied. My meals became monotonous, leaning heavily toward microwave dinners and takeout, leaving the oven untouched and the rich aroma of baked goods locked away in my yearning heart. I could feel the tension building, so I decided to do some digging and looked through the boxes Clara had left unpacked since the move. I found an old, dust-covered cookbook bound in frayed leather that caught my attention, dog-eared and marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Flicking through pages, I discovered handwritten notes in a hurried scrawl that spoke of rituals, of family traditions lost to time, and warnings against the oven being a portal of sorts, a gateway for something sinister. That night, I tentatively approached Clara as she flicked through channels, eyes glazed, and asked her about the cookbook. Her face turned pale, she snatched it from my hands, growling, "You shouldn't have looked at that." I recoiled, and she suppressed a sob as if she were about to spill secrets wrought with anguish. "What is happening, Clara?" I urged, but she shook her head in the manner of a child being lectured, whispering about how the oven shouldn't be used, how it belonged to a legacy far darker than we could comprehend. As the days dragged on, wrapped in her escalating mania, I finally lost my patience. It was a Thursday night, and I needed to bake something, anything, to reclaim my sanity. I woke up in the dead of night with an insatiable hunger for something freshly baked. Quietly, I crept into the kitchen, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and leaned over the counter where my food scale and mixing bowls lay patiently. Ignoring my better judgment, I started to gather my ingredients. I turned the oven knob, feeling a sense of rebellion surge through me, and that beautiful glow flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As I mixed together the batter, I could have sworn I heard something in the distance, a whisper echoing from deep within that old cookbook. The moment my cookies started to brown, the shelves rattled under an invisible force. Confusion flooded my senses, maybe it was an earthquake, or perhaps Clara had returned. But as I peeked through the window into the deep ink of midnight, I saw her. She was standing in the darkness of the courtyard, her back to me, whispering in a language that was sharp and foreign. I felt the door swing open behind me, a gust of wind that carried Clara's scent, something floral yet cold, like autumn leaves. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find the oven door flung wide open, steam billowing out like ethereal smoke. As I leaned forward, horrified, I noticed that my beautifully baked cookies had transformed into grotesque, burnt shapes, almost as though they were alive, broken shells shrieking silently in my mind. A low growl reverberated from the oven, the temperature surged, and the shadows coalesced into a swirling mass. The realization hit me swiftly. Clara had been keeping me from using the oven for a reason, a warning cloaked in paranoia. I reached for the cookbook, my fingers trembling, but Clara appeared behind me, her face twisted, fury and sorrow etched into her features. "You weren't supposed to see," she shrieked, and as I turned, the shadows seemed to reach out, lunging toward her. She stumbled backward, nails clawing at the wooden floor, a scream pouring from her lips as the darkness enveloped her. I was frozen in shock as she was dragged into the abyss of the oven, the growls intensifying, final echoes of her terror haunting the air. I blinked and found myself alone, the kitchen illuminated eerily by the oven's light. The cookbook lay open on the table, words shifting like quicksand, warning me, never again. My heart raced as a burning rage ignited within me. Yet, the overwhelming dread remained. I staggered back, staring at the melted remnants of the cookies that felt like pieces of souls. I stumbled out of the kitchen, breath quickening, feeling Clara's absence like a chasm in my chest. I don't think I will ever truly understand what happened that night. Days passed, and I couldn't bring myself to open the oven again. I lived off cold meals, the silence echoing in the apartment, and every time I caught a glimpse of the cookbook, its call now tainted with dread, I felt a presence lurking within its pages. I've tried to move on, but whispers follow me, warning me that the oven's portal is still alive, a void waiting to swallow more. Now, every time I hear a knock on my door or see a shadow dart in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Clara is still out there. I still hear her voice sometimes, calling softly, begging for help against the darkness, a darkness I helped unleash by breaking a promise. So, here I am, AITA for wanting to use the oven, or is she still watching from whatever realm those shadows had taken her to, forever reminding me of what the oven truly holds? I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag. What I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strange sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood. In that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut? I didn't expect my life to twist into this nightmare the day my husband brought his daughter from his first marriage to live with us. She was only 10, and he thought that having her here would help mend the fractured relationship they had, but, honestly, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Sure, I cared about her, she was a kid, after all, but I wasn't ready to be a parental figure, especially not so soon after we got married, and I made that clear to him, only for him to dismiss my discomfort with comments about being a real family. The first week was a whirlwind of chaos. She arrived with a duffel bag full of clothes but left the rest of her emotional baggage in her soul, the kind nobody else sees until it starts to weigh heavy in the air between us. Her name was Lily, and her big, doe-like eyes always seemed to hold memories of something dark, something unspoken. I sometimes caught her staring out of the window, as if waiting for someone or something that would never come, even as she wore a forced smile. The problem wasn't just her sadness, it was the creeping sense of menace that seemed to follow her, like something from a horror movie. There were strange occurrences, like objects moving on their own, or the times we'd hear soft sobbing at night, which would just be her mumbling in her sleep, but it made me feel paranoid every time I had to check on her. What made things worse was the way my husband looked at her, the way his eyes softened. It made me feel as if I was slowly exiting the picture, replaced by a ghost of his past. One night, while I was supposed to be preparing dinner, I heard her whispering to what I thought was an empty room, and when I walked in, she paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty old book that had mysteriously appeared on the floor. I asked her about it, but her answer made my skin crawl. She said, "It's from my friend," which chilled me to the bone. I brushed it off, but the sense of dread grew with each strange event. The pictures on the wall started to tilt during the night, and whispers would echo in the hallways, trapped in the silence like trapped souls. I found myself constantly wondering if I was losing it, yet every time my husband and I fought, she'd seem to smirk as if she was the one pulling the strings in our marital discord. It escalated when I was packing for a weekend trip, and I found my necklaces strewn across the floor, hung like strange trophies on a noose made of what I could only assume was her sick humor. That night, I had a nightmare, a vision of a shadowy figure lurking behind her, its fingers stretched toward me. I jolted awake to find Lily standing at the end of my bed, her face illuminated by the moon. She simply smiled at me, tilting her head like a dog who hears a distant sound, which sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I screamed, waking my husband, who dismissed my fears as a mom's unfortunate imagination running wild, even when I showed him the book she claimed was from her friend. He read it and laughed, calling it a children's story, but the illustrations alone filled my stomach with dread. It was all about a little girl who made a pact with something ominous, something that came to collect its debts in twisted forms. I kept my confrontations about Lily's behaviors and the odd happenings to myself. After all, I was the one deemed the villain, labeled the stepmother who wouldn't embrace this child. The final straw came when Lily began talking about her friend more frequently. "He's coming to visit," she'd say with a serene smile, her eyes gleaming like the reflection of the moon in water. I thought I could reason with my husband, but he was too enthralled by her presence, a father blinded by the chance to rewrite their sad history. Then one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't like you," is all I could catch, and then my husband's laughter, the sound grating against my instincts. I felt invisible, like a specter lingering in an abandoned house, and everything culminated when I returned home one day to find the house eerily silent. My husband was gone, and so was Lily. Panic gripped my chest like a vice as my calls echoed in the empty halls, the air thickened with uncertainty. Suddenly, the front door swung open. It was my husband, disheveled but alive, and behind him, with a faint glow, was Lily, holding a crude, dark drawing that depicted me, lifeless, under ominous clouds. My heart sank as I noticed her smile was replaced with a sinister, knowing grin as she said, "I told you he'd come back for you." That night, I sat trembling in bed, too terrified to sleep, the drawing propped open in full view, wishing with all my heart that this nightmare was just a figment of my overactive imagination. The atmosphere swirled with tension and malice, and each time I turned over in bed, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting to collect something that had been promised long before I came into the picture. When dawn broke, the reality of my situation struck me, and for the first time, I wondered if I was making a mistake by refusing to take responsibility for the child who seemed to pull our family apart, knowing all too well that ghosts aren't always literal, sometimes they are very, very real, and I had become the woman caught in the suffocating grip of a sinister pact, wondering if I, too, would be forgotten like the countless characters in the tales that had begun to seep into my mind, hoping desperately I wouldn't become a warning for someone else in the dark.
As a kid, I always loved my little brother, Ben, more than anything else in the world. He had this sweet, innocent smile and a giggle that could light up a dark room, but bedtime was always a chore for him. Every night he was terrified of the dark, of shadows lurking in the corners, and I would always let him crawl into bed with me just to soothe him. But soon, a strange dynamic began to form, as he started sleeping more and more in my bed while our parents were unaware, believing I was being a good big brother and watching out for him. But deep down, I wasn't just comforting him. There were whispers every night that crawled under my skin, whispers that only Ben seemed to hear, and it started innocently enough with him waking me up in the middle of the night, eyes wide and trembling, convinced he saw something by the window or a sinister shape in the corner of the room. He would point, and I'd assure him there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows, and I'd pull him close, his tiny body shaking against mine as I told him stories about brave knights and daring dragons to drown out the echoes of whatever haunted him. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at my nerves, until one fateful night when Ben sat up abruptly and stared wide-eyed into the midnight darkness, his little voice trembling as he said with an eerie certainty that there was a man standing at the foot of my bed. My heart dropped. I bolted upright, flipping on the lamp, scanning the room, but there was nothing, just the hollow silence of our old house. I tried to pass it off as a dream or an imagined fear, but as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on my neck prickling with unease, so I wrapped an arm around my brother, feeling his breathing steady against my side, hoping to calm him and myself. But no matter how much I told myself it was all in his head, the truth was that something was very wrong, and that wrongness was growing. Over the next few weeks, the nightmares escalated, with Ben waking me nightly, talking about the man, his description twisted and bleak. He had no face, just a gaping void where features ought to be, and his voice was something we could never hear. Yet it echoed in the back of our minds like a heavy bell tolling in a distant land, and while I dismissed his fears at first, laughing as if it was all part of childhood imagination, I couldn't ignore the impact it had on him. He was losing weight, his eyes growing dark and sunken, and I started to become terrified for him. But every time I questioned him about it, he only told me that the man wanted him to go with him, and that night, I made a decision. I would take charge and protect my brother, so I devised a plan to stay vigilant, to keep Ben close and ward off whatever darkness loomed over him. But that night, I did something I never thought I would. I fell asleep. The warmth of my brother sprawling across my side felt like safety, but I woke. With a start to silence, everything was eerily still as I reached out to find Ben. He was gone. Panic set in as I jumped off the bed, rushing to his room, tossing on the light, but it was empty. My heart raced as I circled the house, calling out for him frantically until I finally found him in the living room. Staring blankly toward the hatch to the attic, my gut churned as I approached him, noticing the way he stood rigid, eyes glowing with a strange light, and when I called his name, he turned, but it wasn't my brother looking back at me. There was a hollow emptiness in his features, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just a cruel imitation of the Ben I knew, and my heart dropped as he said in an oddly distanced voice, "He told me I could come play," before he abruptly turned and began to crawl toward the attic door, and I grasped his arm. Desperation clawing at my throat, pulling him toward me, but as I did, a cold wind swept through the room, and the whispers danced around us like a chilling dance, tearing through my sanity, and as Ben's grip loosened, I realized with horror that he was listening to it, drawn like a moth to a flame, and I could feel the air shifting as a darker presence enveloped us, pressing against my chest, urging me to let go, to succumb to whatever promised my brother sweet dreams and dark fantasies. But it was a lie, I knew that. I yanked him back into my arms, as tight as I could, begging him to remember who he was, who we were, but the look in his eyes was one of dull acceptance, and in that moment, I felt the last of his warmth slip away, snatched by something beyond my comprehension, and the next thing I knew, his tiny body was gone, dissolved like mist into the gathering shadows, leaving me alone standing in the grip of whatever nightmare had claimed him, its smothering presence wrapping around me, pulling me into darkness, and as I stood there, shivering in the heaving silence of the house, I understood too late that I had failed him. My little brother, the one I'd promised to protect, had traded me for something far worse, and as the shadows danced ever closer, I realized there was a reason he had been terrified of the dark, a reason he needed my bed. It was never just about fear, it was about something lurking that fed off that fear, something that made it feel safe to lead him away, and as realization washed over me, I turned, looking up at the attic, knowing there was no choice left. There was only one way to save my brother now, one horrifying truth waiting for me to confront, but deep down I also knew that whatever I faced up there would change me forever, and as I took that first step up the creaky stairs, a whisper followed, coiling around my mind like smoke, saying, "Join us."